bloody path across central New Jersey from the late 1950s to the early 1970s, a serial killer whose story has never, until now, been told. Deadly Secrets is the tale of a cunning psychopath, of the dogged lawmen who pursued him, and of the many victims who even today await justice. It's the product of more than a year of reporting by Robin Gaby Fisher and Judith Lucas of the Star-Ledger of Newark, New Jersey. Deadly Secrets is told in 15 chapters, narrated by Wallace Stroby, a Jersey Shore mystery novelist and an editor at the Star-Ledger. He's the author of The Barbed Wire Kiss and The Heartbreak Lounge. Here's today's installment of Deadly Secrets.
Chapter 1. Shootout in the Storm. Her husband had been dead a little over an hour, and all she could focus on was how Doc Figliolino was flicking the ashes from his cigarette into the cuffs of his gabardine trousers. It was the middle of the night, and a half-dozen people were milling around her living room, amid the lingering smells of Thanksgiving dinner the day before. Frances Figliolino, who delivered each of her 5 children, was chain-smoking in a corner. The Langs, rescue squad volunteers, had come after hearing the radio call. Father Harold Hermans, the chaplain for the Railway Police Department, had given her the news. As soon as she'd seen Father Hermans standing at the front door, the rain and the wind lashing his umbrella, she knew why he was there. "Please sit down," he had said, gently steering her to a chair. "Charles was shot, and he was killed." Elizabeth Betty Bernowski gathered herself and dialed her mother in Newark, then handed the phone to the chaplain, because she could not bring herself to say the words, "Charles is dead." Charles Bernowski, her husband of 9 years, her first and only love, the man with whom she had planned to have a dozen children, was the first railway police officer in anyone's memory to be killed on the beat. Who would do such a thing, she thought to herself. For God's sake, why? Her trance was interrupted by a whimper. 8-year-old Elizabeth, the Bernowskis' oldest child, had slipped into the room. Kathy, 1 year younger, peeked out from behind the bedroom door. The 3 youngest somehow were sleeping through the commotion. A Mother Goose rhyme flashed into Betty's head. There was an old woman who lived in a shoe. She had so many children she didn't know what to do. Hadn't it been only yesterday that they'd all squealed as Charles carved a Thanksgiving turkey? "Daddy, hurry! Daddy, I'm hungry! Daddy, please!" All these kids, and Daddy was dead. She didn't know what to do. As she started to apologize to Doc Figliolino for not having an ashtray, she heard an assistant to Mayor James Donovan tell the mayor, "A guardian will have to be appointed for these children." Betty Bernowski rose from her chair to face the stranger. "These are my children, and I will take care of them," she said, her cheeks flushing with anger. "Now get the hell out of my house." Across the town line in neighboring Linden, a light burned in the kitchen at 402 Bower Street. Rain pounded the windows, and the faint aroma of French fries hung in the air. Veronica Zorinsky stood at the center of a bloody scene. She turned her gaze from her 18-year-old son Robert, nursing a wound in his side, to his cousin Teddy Schiffer, slumped over another chair, ashen and moaning in pain. Veronica's younger sister Irene, who lived at the other end of Bower Street, had called to warn Veronica they were coming. Robert and Teddy were in some kind of trouble, Irene said. She didn't know exactly what, and had come to her house looking for help. She would drive them right over. The boys burst through the front door, accompanied by Irene. Veronica's husband Julius sat quietly in a kitchen chair, and their 15-year-old daughter Judith hovered nearby in the corner. "What happened?" Veronica asked her son. "There was a fight," Robert started to say. Veronica wanted to call the police. "No," Robert said. "No. I shot a cop." A storm was pounding New Jersey that Thanksgiving weekend in 1958. The rain came in fits, blowing sideways during heavy wind gusts, then quieting down before the next assault. It was during one of those lulls that residents of West Milton Avenue and Rahway began calling the police department to say they heard what sounded like gunshots. Patrolman George P. Haim had just checked the doors at Superior Pharmacy on St. George's Avenue when the police radio crackled with the voice of Desk Sergeant Ed Coffey reporting a possible shooting. P. Haim looked at his watch. 10:45 p.m. Just a little over an hour before the end of his shift. It never failed. A quiet night never ends quietly. The drill that night was that P. Haim would check the businesses along the east side of St. George's Avenue while his younger partner, Charles Bernowski, took the west side. P. Haim steered his police cruiser back toward Miller Pontiac, where he had dropped off Bernowski a few minutes before. Passing by the dealership, Pehame looked for his partner so that they could answer the call together. Bernowski was nowhere in sight, and Pehame drove on. When he turned the corner on the West Milton, 2 men frantically waved at him. "There's a man in my kitchen," one of them said. "He looks like a cop." Just inside the kitchen door, a man lay face down on the linoleum floor. The cape on his shiny black rain slicker fanned out over his shoulders, making him look like a giant bird. "Charlie," Pehame said, dropping to his knees. Bernowski's eyes were closed, and blood flowed from his mouth. Pehame picked himself up and ran back to his cruiser. He called the police station on the radio. "It's Bernowski," he shouted. "He's down. Get an ambulance out here now." John DiStefano had just ordered coffee and a sandwich at the all-night Grand Diner when he heard the call on his walkie-talkie. The heavyset detective pulled up to 453 West Milton Avenue at the same time the ambulance arrived. He knew from the chatter on the police radio that Bernowski had apparently interrupted a robbery at Miller Pontiac. After he was shot, DiStefano figured, Bernowski must have stumbled into the nearest house looking for help. Pehame was standing outside, crying, when DiStefano arrived. In the kitchen, DiStefano gently turned the lanky young officer onto his back. Bernowski was covered in blood, and DiStefano could see he had been shot in the face and the chest. His Colt .38 service revolver was beneath him. All 6 cartridges had been discharged. DiStefano, a 10-year veteran, fought back tears. Bernowski hadn't been with the department 4 years. He had a wife and a bunch of kids, and now he was going to die. "Get a priest," DiStefano said to a patrolman standing nearby. Then he stepped aside to make way for the ambulance crew. Charles Bernowski was nothing like the boys Betty Byrne had dated as a teenager growing up in Newark. She was 17 when they met. He was 19, and he seemed even older. Maybe it was because he was so tall that he seemed more mature. Maybe it was his earnestness. The year was 1947. June had just turned into July. Betty was sitting on the front stoop of her house on Broadway in Newark when Charles approached in a shiny black 1939 Ford. Betty had noticed the car before. There were baby booties hanging from the rearview mirror. But this time the car stopped, and a good-looking fellow stuck his head out of the window. "You want to talk?" she asked him. She could tell he was shy. "Park the car and come on up," Betty said. Any misgivings evaporated when he told her the baby booties belonged to a niece, his goddaughter. He lived with his parents a block and a half away. That was the beginning of an 18-month courtship, followed by a traditional Catholic wedding at Our Lady of Good Counsel Church in Newark in January 1949. When Betty and Charles talked about having a family, it was always a big one. Daughter Elizabeth was born a year and a half later. The other children followed, a year or 2 apart. The Bernowskis was a conventional marriage. She was, as she liked to say, chief bottle washer and corrections officer. He was the soft-hearted dad who never had the time or the inclination to carry out punishment. There weren't enough hours in the day for Charles. Besides working the night shift as a patrolman for the Rahway Police Department, he drove a school bus during the week and delivered newspapers and eggs on weekends. In his spare time, he built watches, putting together intricate parts he picked up at flea markets and antique stores. The children followed Charles wherever he went. When he candled eggs on Saturday, they followed him into the basement and spent whole evenings there, content to watch him inspect each one for cracks and blood spots. When he sat at his desk in the dining room, patiently lining up watch parts, the kids were his captive audience until Betty reminded everyone it was bedtime. Charles was a solid guy. He had chosen not to join his mother behind the bar at the Tally Ho Bar and Grill in Newark because he disliked tavern life. He never smoked or drank. Betty was spontaneous and excitable. He offered support, and she leaned on him. On the evening of November 28, 1958, Charles appeared lighthearted and happy. He had taken his dinner break at home. They ate Thanksgiving leftovers, then he went back to work. Not long afterward, the police car pulled back into the driveway. "Why are you home?" Betty asked when he walked through the door. It was his turn to walk the beat, Charles explained. He needed his raincoat and rubber boots. Grabbing his gear, Charles looked in on their sleeping children and kissed Betty goodbye. He pulled on his dark blue police cap, the one Betty had stitched the cross inside to protect him, and went back out into the rain. 3 hours later, Father Hermans was standing at the front door. It was after 1 a.m. when Betty Bernowski's living room began to empty. She ordered her children off to bed and stared at the empty desk in the dining room. The Thanksgiving dishes were still stacked on the table, washed, dried, and ready to be put away. "Oh, Charles," she said to herself, "what do I do?" Betty looked at her mother, who had come as soon as she got the call from Betty and the chaplain. Her mother looked stricken. Betty decided she would wait a few hours before sharing the secret that she and Charles had been keeping. She was carrying their sixth child. "Why did you shoot a cop?" Veronica Zorinsky asked her son. "The cop shot Teddy," he said, "so I shot the cop." Robert's cousin had been hit in the chest, and the bullet passed right through him. A slug was buried in Robert's left hip. They needed a doctor. A single phone call and there would be an ambulance out front, lights flashing, ready to take them to the hospital. But if a cop had been shot, and if two boys showed up in the emergency room with gunshot wounds? Veronica loved her boy like nobody's business. She made a decision. It wasn't the first time she would cover for him, and it wouldn't be the last. As the others sat there, panic-stricken, she went to fetch a pair of tweezers, tongue depressors, a bottle of hydrogen peroxide, and a roll of gauze. She leaned over her nephew, dabbed peroxide in the hole in his chest, and covered it with gauze. Then she held the metal tips of the tweezers over an open flame on the stovetop and turned her attention to her son. Carefully, she leaned over Robert. Using the tongue depressor to separate the skin, she burrowed into the button-sized hole in his hip, pulling a single .38 caliber bullet from deep in his flesh. She bandaged the wound and looked around at everyone in the room, her husband, her daughter, her sister-in-law, and the two wounded boys. It was a look they all recognized. "What happened tonight must never leave this house," Veronica said. "No one must ever tell." Chapter 2. "You want to ride?" The white Ford convertible rolled up beside them, and the man behind the wheel flashed a crooked smile. "You want to ride?" 14-year-old Sharon Kennedy and two friends had spent the afternoon swimming and sunning at the municipal pool. Day was turning to dusk, and the hot pavement of the parking lot sizzled under their feet. A ride home sounded good. In Linden, a small industrial city with tight-knit neighborhoods not far from smokestacks and go-go bars, the pool was a welcome refuge for kids looking for something to do. Robert Zorinsky was 20, the same age as Sharon's older brother, and he was a familiar face at poolside. What was the harm in hitching a ride? The girls piled into his car. The summer of 1961 had been a time of typical teenage rebellion for the girls, full of chasing boys and staying out past curfew. And even as she got into the car, Sharon knew she really shouldn't. She didn't know much about the man behind the wheel, except for his name and the fact that he spent a lot of time in his convertible. Zorinsky had wavy, slicked back hair and a pudgy face. He wasn't tall, but he wore stacked shoes and he was powerfully built. Looking at him in his skin-tight muscle shirt, Sharon thought he had the thickest arms she had ever seen. On the ride home, rock and roll was playing on the radio, and Zorinsky tapped his steering wheel to the beat. He dropped off one friend, then the other, and Sharon moved up to the front seat. Zorinsky was quiet. Was he stuck up? Maybe shy? Sharon listened to the music and watched the street signs go by. As they approached her block, she gathered up her terry towel and beach bag so she could jump out of the car when it stopped. But when they reached her street, Zorinsky turned the other way. They were driving toward the neighboring town of Rahway. "Why didn't you take me home?" Sharon asked, thinking Zorinsky had mistakenly taken a wrong turn. "We're going for a ride," Zorinsky said, staring straight ahead. The music blared and Sharon sat speechless as Zorinsky drove across the town line. He headed south on Route 1, and the longer he drove, the more jittery she became. Dusk turned to darkness, and soon Sharon didn't know where they were anymore. She thought they were probably still in New Jersey, but she wasn't really sure, and Zorinsky wasn't talking. Twice, when Zorinsky stopped at a traffic light, she tried to get out of the car, but the handle on the passenger side door was missing. That had seemed innocent enough when the girls had first gotten into the car, but now Sharon felt trapped. Each time she rattled the door, Zorinsky reached over with his strong hands and pulled her closer. They had been driving for what seemed like an eternity, maybe 35 or 40 minutes, when Sharon saw a sign for Route 36. Zorinsky drove another few minutes, past two big white tanks with black letters that said New Jersey Natural Gas, then turned onto a street named First Avenue. Another sign said Atlantic Highlands. As they drove, Zorinsky grew more and more agitated. He began to curse in a whiny voice. Still looking straight ahead, he reached over and grabbed at Sharon's legs, and she jerked away. He cursed some more, never looking at her. He drove off the main road and headed up a winding hill to a remote wooded area. Sharon saw a quarry and a gravel pit, but no sign of life. Zorinsky parked the car. How could this be happening, she thought. She looked over at the man next to her and found him staring at her. His face was mask-like, and his icy blue eyes were blank and glassy. Zorinsky held Sharon's gaze, but he seemed to be looking through her. Terrified, she turned away. That's when he pounced. He savagely ripped at her shorts and her blouse. He yanked the gold chain from her neck, the cross that was on it she'd worn since her parents gave it to her when she was 7 years old. Sharon grabbed for the door handle to try to get out, then remembered it wasn't there. She kicked furiously at the door. Zorinsky punched her in the chest, knocking the breath out of her. She was now helpless, and Zorinsky continued to attack. There was nothing explicitly sexual about it. As vicious as he had been while subduing her, he now very gently removed her bra and used it to tie her hands behind her head. Sharon thought he acted like a sissy. But a second later he turned violent again, biting her breasts, her neck, and her toes. He punched her so hard in the head she saw stars. In a surreal moment, as Sharon lay there dazed and bleeding, Zorinsky leaned over and reached in the glove compartment for a jar of Vaseline. He opened the jar, dug out a handful of the greasy jelly, and smeared it on the windshield. Sharon noticed mosquitoes sticking to it. "This guy's completely crazy," she said to herself. Feeling as if she was about to die, Sharon opened her mouth and sank her teeth into Zorinsky's arm. He exploded, spewing profanities, and bashed her in the head, chest, and arms with his fists. He ordered her to beg for mercy, but she refused. Sharon kicked at the car door again and again. Finally, it flew open. She scrambled out and ran aimlessly in the dark, but Zorinsky was right behind her. He tackled her and threw her to the ground, then held her down by her shoulders. His grip on her was crushing. "Scream!" Zorinsky seethed. "Beg for your life." Sharon said nothing. "I said scream," he said. Sharon spat in his face and braced for the next punch. Instead, Zorinsky recoiled. He stood up and dragged her back to the car. Calmly, he started the engine, wiped the windshield clean, turned up the volume on the radio, and drove her home to Linden without saying a word. Parking at the curb, Zorinsky stepped out of the car so Sharon could climb out the driver's side door and squeeze past him into the street. She heard the tires roll away as she walked, then ran to the front door. Pushing her way inside, she bounded up the stairs to her room and collapsed in a heap on the bed. Her clothes were in tatters, and her whole body ached. Her parents were away on vacation. Her sister and brothers were sleeping. Thank God for small favors, she thought. For the rest of the summer, Sharon wore clothes that covered the bite marks and bruises all over her body. At bedtime, she changed into long pajamas. She told no one what happened. How could she? Her parents wouldn't understand, and what would her friends think? On many nights, Sharon awoke from the same wrenching nightmare. Zorinsky had returned for her. She was sure he would come back one day. He wouldn't. But there were other girls who would not be so lucky. Chapter 3. Little Girl Gone. What a terribly odd sight it was, the young tomboy sprawled in a thicket of winter reeds, her mouth twisted into a grimace, her adolescent body contorted as if frozen at the exact moment of death. Against the gray of that chilly November morning, the purplish red of her bruised and battered face and the blue of her bloodless lips were shockingly vivid. Patrolman Thomas Dalton of the Keensburg Police Department arrived at the crime scene, 150 yards east of Keensburg High School, on the south side of the New Jersey Central Railroad tracks, at 7:35 a.m. on that Tuesday, November 5th, 1968. In his report, Dalton described a schoolgirl, quote, lying on her back, head facing north, having her legs facing south on an incline. The girl's pea coat, print blouse, and bra were bunched up around her shoulders, and her black skirt and gossamer slip had been shoved up to her waist. Her underpants were half off. Her left foot was covered with a white ankle sock, and her right foot was bare. A pile of school books rested nearby, near a pair of well-worn penny loafers and a black vinyl purse containing a pencil sharpener and some colored pencils. Minutes before Patrolman Dalton arrived, a distraught woman had telephoned the Keensburg Police Department. Loretta Connor said her sister, missing since dinner time the night before, had been found by her husband in a grassy area about 30 feet from the abandoned tracks. He had thrown his coat over her and run home. Her name was Jane Duryea. Life had been one heartache after another for 13-year-old Jane Duryea. Her father had died suddenly when she was 8, and cancer took her mother 5 years later. The mother's death left Jane and her sister Joan, who was a year older, orphaned in the family apartment in East Harlem. Dolores Ramirez, another sister, was living downstairs in the same building. She moved her family upstairs to take care of the girls. That same month, February of 1968, Dolores decided it was best to take everyone away from the perils of the city. Packing up Jane, Joan, and her own 2 toddlers, Dolores moved with her husband Louis to New Jersey's Bayshore area. The girl's other sister, Loretta, and her husband, Ronald Connors, had settled there a few years earlier. The teens' new homes were a mile apart. Jane lived with Dolores, just 20 years old, in the East Keensburg section of Middletown Township, and Joan with 31-year-old Loretta and her family in Keensburg. Everyone had to adjust. The Bayshore, with its converted bungalows and small-town atmosphere, was so different from 116th Street it might as well have been another planet. The family's homes were modest by Bayshore standards. Each had 2 small bedrooms. Joan shared a bunk bed with Loretta's 6-year-old son. Jane moved in with Dolores' 2 children, ages 3 and 4. For 2 married sisters taking care of young children, raising their teenage siblings wasn't easy, and their husbands, who drove for the same trucking company in Jersey City, had to stretch their paychecks even further. Jane and Joan, still grieving the loss of their mother, were inseparable. They were also almost total opposites. The girls were small and willowy, with sandy-colored hair, but the similarities pretty much stopped there. Jane's clothes were always disheveled. Joan starched her skirts and never got her shoes dirty. Jane was happiest tossing a ball or running a relay race. If she had $1, she would give away 75 cents. She was happy-go-lucky and fearless. Joan was prim and proper and preferred dolls to sports. Timid and shy, she always seemed to be sick. So even though Joan was older, Jane played the role of big sister. One time, the doctor gave Joan a needle, and Jane punched him in the eye. "You hurt my sister," she said, dressing down the flustered doctor. A stomachache kept Joan home from school on Monday, November 4th, 1968. There would be a football game after school that day, Keensburg's junior varsity against Point Pleasant. Jane loved football, and she and Joan had planned to go cheer for the home team. After school, Jane dropped in on Joan at Loretta's house, ran an errand for Loretta at the corner store, then went to the game by herself. She left the game early and went back to see Joan, taking the shortcut she had traveled dozens of times before, a well-worn path along the abandoned Central Railroad tracks. It was 5 p.m. when Jane arrived at Loretta's house to visit with Joan. Loretta said she would call a cab for Jane. It was getting dark, and it was a long mile home. After a few minutes of chatting, though, Jane became impatient. She had homework to do, she declared. Their mother, before she died, had made the girls promise to work hard in school. Jane wanted to get back home and study. She picked up her school books and her sewing basket, which held the skirt she was mending for sewing class, and said goodbye. Joan watched as her sister walked through the front gate toward the tracks. "Why don't you come back in?" Joan called after her. "You won't make it home before dark." "I will, because I can run really fast," Jane said, and off she went. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. At 7:15, Dolores called Loretta looking for Jane. She should have been home already. The trip between the sisters' houses was a 15-minute walk, and Jane had started off running. Joan knew something was wrong. It wasn't like Jane to lollygag. The 2 older sisters started searching, Dolores pushing her toddlers in a baby carriage. They walked the path starting from opposite ends, calling Jane's name. Maybe she had fallen and hurt herself. Their husbands joined the search. Joan stayed behind and called the police. They told her about the 48-hour rule. Her sister would be considered a runaway until a couple days had passed. Then they would start looking. Joan knew Jane would never run away, not without taking her. The family searched all that night and into the morning. Jane's brothers-in-law walked 2 miles of track with flashlights. When they finished, they started again. They searched at midnight, then again at 2 in the morning. At daybreak, they went back and searched some more. That's when Loretta's husband found Jane in the high grass about 30 feet off the beaten path. For the next few hours, Jane's broken body lay there while the police collected evidence. Finally, she was taken to the Monmouth County morgue. A few days later, Jane was buried with her mother and grandfather at Maple Grove Cemetery in Kew Gardens, Queens. The murder was front-page news in the local newspaper the following day, next to a headline about the newly elected president, Richard Nixon. Ronald Connors quickly found himself under police scrutiny. He had discovered Jane's body, and with no other leads, investigators focused on those closest to the teen. Connors and Luis Ramirez, Dolores' husband, were questioned for hours, then days. Both took polygraphs and passed. Joan isolated herself after school by staying inside, but that couldn't shield her from the cruelty of a group of neighborhood boys who ran past the house screaming, "He's killing me! He's killing me!" or from the phone calls of a prankster who claimed he knew who killed Jane. The police traced the calls to a bar in nearby Leonardo, and the caller admitted he was just having some fun with the family. In the months that followed, investigators interviewed dozens of people, but the leads went nowhere, and fresher cases began to take precedence. Eventually, the crime scene evidence was stashed away in a metal locker in the basement of Monmouth County Police Precinct. Another cold case, placed on the shelf to gather dust. But tucked inside that metal locker, wrapped in the folds of the white gossamer slip Jane Duryea wore on her final day, was something that years later would solve the mystery of her death. Chapter 4. Enter the Detective. The church bells were ringing. People in the bayshore town of Atlantic Highlands set their clocks by the bells of St. Agnes Church, and for the Calandrello family of Center Avenue, the tolling of 6 o'clock meant dinner time. The jug of milk in the refrigerator was almost empty. It was a summer Monday evening, August 25th, 1969. "Mama, I'm going to get the milk now," Rosemary Calandrello said, taking 2 of the $1 bills her mother had left out for the insurance man. "Milk and ice pops, Mama, please?" Yes, Agnes Calandrello said, shooing her only daughter toward the front door. "Hurry now, Rosemary. If you don't get back soon, you'll be sorry. Your daddy doesn't feel good, and I don't want him worrying about you." Rosemary was a bookish girl, with a page boy haircut, bushy black eyebrows, and thick eyeglasses. Excruciatingly shy, she had just turned 17 and only recently had gone on her first date. She was the youngest of 4 children, the only one still living at home, and her life pretty much revolved around school, scouts, and her family. Her parents were strict and, some thought, smothering. They were keenly aware of what Rosemary did and where she was at all times, but they had little to worry about. She was still more like a child than a teen. She was still afraid of the dark. Rosemary headed out the door in her bare feet. The store was only 2 blocks away. "Don't worry, Mama," she called back over her shoulder. "The ice pops will melt. I'll be right back." Tucking the money into the back pocket of her corn-colored shorts, Rosemary walked through the front gate and turned right on Center Avenue toward the grocery store and the ice cream shop. Her mother turned back to a simmering pot on the stove. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The trip to town shouldn't have taken any longer than that. Agnes Calandrello walked out to the sidewalk and looked down Center Avenue. No Rosemary. After 20 minutes, her husband woke from his nap. Dinner was drying out. "Where's Rosemary?" he asked. "Rosemary should have been home by now," she said. Sergeant Sam Guzzi had just begun his shift when Rosemary's mother walked into police headquarters. Darkness was falling, but the late summer air was scorching, and Guzzi noticed the woman's dark hair was damp and stuck to the back of her neck. "My daughter is missing," she said. The late 1960s were a time of relaxed attitudes when teens were demanding and getting more freedom. "Not Rosemary," Agnes Calandrello explained, one word running into the next. Rosemary never challenged the rules. She never even questioned them. She wasn't allowed out at night unless she was chauffeured by her parents. Indeed, she wasn't allowed out during the day unless there was a good reason. There was no chance Rosemary had met up with friends and lost track of time, her mother insisted. No chance she would go somewhere without asking her parents' permission. Agnes was a nervous woman by nature, and a homebody. Her husband was sickly and had taken leave from his job at the post office. They rarely left the house, not even to run errands downtown. After their sons left home, it had become their daughter's responsibility to do the grocery shopping and pay the household bills. She was happy to oblige. Just that morning, Rosemary had walked to town to pay the water bill. She had brought home the receipt and $10 in change to her mother. "If only I would have known we were out of milk then," Agnes told Guzzi. "If I had known then, she wouldn't have gone out the second time. But we didn't know we were out of milk." Guzzi had an easygoing way about him, but when it came to his work, he was known to be relentless and thorough. He'd grown up in Atlantic Highlands and put in 15 years on the police force. He knew a little about everyone, including the Calandrellos. Agnes's characterization of her daughter rang true. He wanted to reassure her, wanted to comfort her. But how? Guzzi sent her home to wait with her husband by the phone. Maybe Rosemary would call, he said. If she did, she would want her mother to be there. But in his gut, Guzzi knew Rosemary wouldn't call. Picking up the telephone, Guzzi dialed the county dispatcher. A teenager was missing, he explained. Send an all-points bulletin to police departments around the state. Pronto. Minutes later, the teletype machine next to Guzzy's desk began to clatter. He watched, riveted to each letter. Missing girl. Last seen Center Avenue in Atlantic Highlands around 6 p.m. 17 years old, 5 feet 7, 120 pounds, dark hair, dark eyes, glasses, wearing yellow shorts and sleeveless shirt, barefoot. Guzzy reached for the bulletin as it scrolled out of the machine. The first thing people noticed about him were his hands. They were the size of dinner plates. He ripped the paper from the machine and read the message again, this time focusing in on one thing. A girl planning to run away would not leave home without her shoes. Atlantic Highlands was like every small town when it came to gossip. By morning, people all over the borough knew a girl was missing, and everyone was speculating about her disappearance. Was she a runaway? Had something terrible happened? Guzzy, a fitful sleeper even on peaceful nights, had hardly dozed off and was back at headquarters before sunrise. As the only officer assigned to the case, he had his work cut out for him. The Atlantic Highlands Police Department in 1969 consisted of a single room in an old grocery store, with a teletype, a typewriter, and a rotary telephone. One end of the building was partitioned off and used as municipal court. A holding cell was located at the other end. Everyone on the 14-man force, from the chief to the patrolman, shared a single gray metal desk, each officer contributing his own coffee stains and ink smudges to the scratched surface. Most of the open cases were petty crimes, bicycle thefts, and bad checks, and most were assigned to Guzzy, the primary detective. Sitting down at the desk, Guzzy pushed the other files aside and opened the one marked Rosemary Calandrello. Before he could grab his second cup of coffee, he had a lead. 4 high school boys, neighbors and classmates of Rosemary, claimed they had seen her riding through town with a stranger the night before. Michael Hazeltine lived next door to the Calandrellos. He was driving down Center Avenue with 3 of his buddies, he said, when he spotted Rosemary riding in a beat-up white Ford Galaxy convertible. He didn't recognize the older guy at the wheel. Hazeltine and the other boys talked about how strange it was to see timid little Rosemary with the stranger. In the 9 years Hazeltine had known her, he had never even heard of Rosemary having a boyfriend, and she wouldn't get into his car unless she was with his sister. When the convertible turned in front of him, Hazeltine followed. It was late summer, and he and his friends were just out for a drive. They had nothing better to do. It looked to Hazeltine like the man behind the wheel was talking to Rosemary. He kept turning toward her. She was seated with her back against the passenger door. She held her eyeglasses in her left hand, which was resting on the back of the front seat. Hazeltine couldn't tell if Rosemary was talking back. Hazeltine kept pace for 3 blocks. Then the convertible turned left. Hazeltine turned right, toward a friend's house. Guzzy took written statements from the boys. Based on their recollections, he released a composite sketch of the man and a description of the car to the newspapers. Barbara Hardy of Leonardo picked up her copy of the Red Bank Daily Register. She got a sick feeling as she read the item about the missing girl. The item read, "Police today were still looking for Rosemary Calandrello, 17, of 93 Center Avenue, Atlantic Highlands, missing since Monday night when she was last seen in a white convertible driven by the man at right." 2 days before Rosemary's disappearance, and at about the same time of day, Hardy's 12-year-old daughter, Lydia, and a friend, Robin Spangenberg, had been walking along Center Avenue in Leonardo, the same Center Avenue that continued through neighboring Atlantic Highlands, when a stranger in a white Ford with a black ragtop pulled up alongside them. The driver just smiled, then drove on. When he returned moments later, he stuck his head out the window and asked, "Would you like a ride or would you rather walk?" "We'll walk, mister," Robin Spangenberg said, and the man drove off again. The third time he pulled up, he was more persistent. "Are you sure you don't want to ride?" "We're positive," Lydia Hardy said, and the girl started running towards home. "What bad little girls you are for not accepting my ride," the man said, and laughed. When Lydia got home and told her mother about the man, Barbara Hardy called the local police to report the incident. Her daughter's description of the driver matched the composite she was looking at now in the Daily Register. Bulky build, chubby face, the style of sideburns people called mutton chops. The description of the car matched, too. Hardy picked up the phone and dialed the number mentioned in the newspaper story. Guzzy took the call. Is there anything more you can tell me? He asked when she finished her story. Her daughter had memorized the car's license plate, Hardy said. She had written it down. Guzzy ran the plate. CTI 109. The car was registered to a Julius Zirinsky of 402 Bower Street in Linden. Guzzy called the Linden Police Department. Do you know the car? He asked Lieutenant Joseph Antilli. Oh, yes, Antilli replied. We know the car. The car belongs to the son, Robert, Antilli said. Robert Zirinsky. Chapter 5. House of Lies. The big man with the oversized hands stood on the stoop of the Zirinsky home and introduced himself as Sergeant Sam Guzzy from the Atlantic Highlands Police Department. What do you want? Veronica Zirinsky asked. Linden, the industrial town where the Zirinskys lived, was 30 miles north of the Bayshore community of Atlantic Highlands. Guzzy explained he was there because a girl from his town was missing. We're looking for Robert Zirinsky, he said. Robert is out, Veronica responded. Guzzy held up the arrest warrant and read it to her. On the 25th day of August, 1969, in the borough of Atlantic Highlands, Robert Zirinsky did contribute to the delinquency of a minor, one Rosemary Calandrello. He took her out of town without the consent of her parents and failed to return her to her home. Impossible, Veronica Zirinsky said. Robert had been home Monday night. He'd been upstairs with his wife, Lynn. Ask her yourself. She'll tell you. At the moment, Lynn was with Robert at a relative's house, Veronica said. I'll call and tell them to come home. Lynn Zirinsky knew all too well that loyalty was crucial to survival in the Zirinsky household. Loyalty, secrecy, and obedience to Robert. She had learned her place in the 2.5 years she'd been in the family. If the Zirinskys were pieces on a chessboard, Robert was king, his mother queen. Lynn, Robert's father Julius, and Robert's sister Judith were lowly pawns. When Robert was not tormenting his father, he was berating his 21-year-old wife. She could see an outburst coming a mile away. One minute he was Mr. Nice Guy. The next, his lips would quiver, a sure sign the next tirade was coming. Only his mother was immune from his attacks. The smallest things set Robert off. During one of his rages, he crushed all of the costume jewelry in Lynn's jewelry box. Another time, he smashed a tomato in her face. Then there were the unspeakable sexual indignities, secrets Lynn would never tell anyone. If you do, they won't believe you anyway, Robert would say. If you tell my mother, she'll throw you out. Veronica Zirinsky was 48, and she lived for her son. No one dared say a word against him in her presence. In high school, when a girl broke up with him, Veronica went to her parents in tears, begging them to make her daughter reconsider. Someone once told her that Robert had boasted about setting neighborhood animals on fire, and she walked off in a huff. No matter what Robert did, Veronica blamed someone else. She ignored his boorishness, even when it was aimed at her submissive, skittish husband. When Robert knocked his father off a kitchen chair, Veronica walked out of the room without a word. The times he called him a dumb Jew, she pretended not to hear. Lynn complained to Veronica once about Robert's cruelty, but never again. Do you think anyone else has it better, Lynn? Veronica had scoffed. You don't know what it's like behind other people's closed doors. Whatever went on inside the Zirinsky house was to stay there, Veronica had warned Lynn. Every family had secrets, and those secrets were sacred. Eventually, after Robert choked Lynn to the point where she nearly lost consciousness, she stopped even trying to defend herself. That time, she had not brought his soda fast enough. So he pushed her to the floor, wrapped his fleshy hands around her slender neck, and squeezed until she felt her eyes bulging out of her head. I'm sorry, she had cried as the room got smaller and smaller. Next time it'll be worse, he promised. Veronica pretended not to hear Lynn's cries. When she met Robert Zirinsky in the winter of 1964, Lynn McDermott thought it was an act of God. She was 17 and starved for attention. Her family life had been anything but ideal. By the time she was 13, both parents were dead. Lynn and 5 siblings were left to raise themselves, while their 21-year-old sister worked 2 jobs to support the family. 8 years her senior, Robert told Lynn he worked with his father in the family business delivering produce to markets in Middlesex and Monmouth counties. He could be charming, and he spent money freely, taking her to Broadway plays and fancy restaurants. When she finally met his parents, they seemed like a real-life Ozzie and Harriet. Veronica, with her coiffed hair and stylish clothes, looked the part of the perfect suburban housewife, and her husband doted on her. She cooked dinners from a cookbook, kept a tidy home, and pampered her son, even though he was plenty old enough to take care of himself. Lynn was smitten with the whole package. She could imagine herself, finally, having a nice, normal life. Less than a year after she met Robert, Lynn learned she was pregnant with his child. To her great disappointment, Robert wanted it kept quiet. She gave birth on July 26, 1966, 1 month after her high school graduation, and named her son Robert Michael McDermott. When Robert finally decided to tell his mother, Veronica said, "You have to bring Lynn and the baby home." Lynn and 2-month-old Bobby moved into the room on the second floor of the Zirinsky home. There was never any talk of finding a place of their own. Eventually, Robert got around to proposing marriage. The wedding took place January 20th, 1967, at the Presbyterian Church in Saraville. Neither dressed up for the occasion. Lynn tried to be happy, but Robert hardly looked at her during the ceremony. He clearly just wanted to get it over with. Robert's younger sister, Judith, and her husband, Peter Sapsa, stood up for the couple. Veronica had demanded that the ceremony be held in secret because she had led the rest of the family to believe Robert and Lynn were married before their child was conceived. After their vows, the newlyweds did not even go to lunch to celebrate. Robert drove to the Two Guys discount department store from Harrison to pick up lumber. Then he and Lynn went home to begin their life as husband and wife. The ink on their marriage license had barely dried when Lynn discovered a different side of Robert, a side he had managed to hide while they were dating. Veronica's family was visiting at the time. Robert shouted downstairs for Lynn to bring him a snack. The relatives poked fun at her. "What are you, his servant?" Embarrassed, Lynn stayed put. "Lynn!" Robert shouted again. "Lynn!" "You'd better go up there," Veronica warned. Lynn bounded up the stairs to their room. What she found took her breath away. Robert had cut up all of her clothes. He grabbed her by the neck. "The next time I call you, you jump," he said. Lynn knew the relatives heard the commotion, but when she went back downstairs, she felt everyone was acting as if nothing had happened. Lynn quickly realized the Zirinsky family was not what she had imagined. The picture of normalcy on the outside, it was insular and lonely behind closed doors. The only outsiders allowed into the house were Veronica's siblings. Her 2 brothers came for coffee every morning, and her 3 sisters accompanied her to bingo each week at the local Catholic church. Veronica discouraged Lynn from having friends, and without a driver's license, she had limited opportunities to see her own family. The stands of evergreens ringing the Zirinsky home, which Lynn had once loved for the privacy they provided, had begun to make her feel as if she were living in a fortress. Lynn's only happiness was little Bobby, and she made him her world. She loved him so much, she would say, that when she held him, her heart hurt for fear something bad would happen to him. She spent every waking moment with the boy, teaching him the alphabet, numbers, colors. Still a toddler, he was talking, reading a few words, and picking out his own clothes. Bobby had developed asthma at 9 months old. Once a month he had an attack, with high fever, then quickly recovered. But one night, after a 4th of July barbecue in 1968, Bobby looked especially flushed. Lynn took his temperature. The thermometer read 105. Lynn called the doctor, as she had many times before. "Give him a sponge bath and his asthma medicine," the doctor said. She sat up with Bobby all night. By morning he was listless, and his breathing was labored. "Put him near the phone," the doctor said when Lynn called again. She did as she was told. "Bring him to the hospital right away," the doctor said. 12 hours later, the boy was dead. He was weeks shy of his 2nd birthday. Lynn and Robert were by his bedside. The only real kindness Lynn had ever seen from Robert was toward their son. Sometimes, when Bobby was sitting in his rocking chair in front of the TV, Robert would just stare at him, telling Lynn he was admiring how beautiful the boy was. Lynn looked at her lifeless child and wanted to die. "The only good thing in my life is gone," she said to herself. The funeral director took photographs of Bobby in his tiny coffin. Dressed in a light-colored suit jacket and shorts, blonde curls framing his face, he looked like a sleeping angel. Lynn tucked the pictures in the back of a photo album, hardly able to look at them. Robert took one of the pictures and kept it in his car. Sergeant Guzzi left the Zorinsky's front door, warrant still in hand, and walked to his unmarked police car to await the arrival of Robert and Lynn. Veronica Zorinsky was a force to be reckoned with. Guzzi could see that. The stare she had directed at him when he explained why he had come was murderous. She's something else, he thought. Sitting in his car as the sun began to set, Guzzi thought about Rosemary Calandrello and how frightened she must be, if she were still alive. Her mother had said she was afraid of the dark. It was 10 o'clock when Guzzi saw the headlights of the Ford convertible illuminate the driveway and Robert Zorinsky get out of the car. Zorinsky's muscles bulged under his skin-tight T-shirt, and his thick sideburns were wet with perspiration. The woman with Zorinsky was tiny, the size of a young teenager, and she looked frightened. "Is that your car?" Guzzi asked, approaching Zorinsky as he walked toward his house. "Yes," Zorinsky said, walking on. "You are under arrest for contributing to the delinquency of a minor in the Rosemary Calandrello missing persons case," Guzzi said. Zorinsky turned toward Guzzi, and they stood face to face. Those eyes, Guzzi thought, they're just like the mother's, cold as ice. With his family looking on, Zorinsky listened to Guzzi read his rights. "You can talk now if you wish," Guzzi said after the recitation. "Were you in Atlantic Highlands on Monday?" "I have no idea where Atlantic Highlands is," Zorinsky responded flatly. "Tell him, Lynn," Veronica called from the porch. "Tell him that Robert was home with you that night." "Yes," Lynn said. "Robert was home with me." Lynn Zorinsky cried when she read the newspaper stories in the following days about her husband's arrest. According to the papers, the police were claiming several young girls from the Atlantic Highlands area had come forward to say they'd been approached by a man who looked like Zorinsky in a beat-up convertible, and he tried to lure them into his car. Lynn knew her husband was capable of great cruelty. She knew he had a history of scrapes with the local police. She also knew he was familiar with the Bayshore. They had met there 4 years earlier, and he seemed to know every back road. The first time they had sex, it was in his convertible in a wooded area in Atlantic Highlands. But was he a killer? He couldn't be. He was all she had. Chapter 6. Connecting the Dots. Sergeant Sam Guzzi hunkered down at the lone desk in the Atlantic Highlands Police Department, surrounded by empty coffee cups and half-eaten donuts, and wondered which of his leads to chase next. He had been going almost non-stop since the disappearance of 17-year-old Rosemary Calandrello, and worry was etched in the dark circles under his soft brown eyes. Whenever Guzzi plunged into an investigation, he had trouble letting go. His work came before everything, and his 20-year marriage had recently ended in divorce. Without a wife to go home to, he easily became obsessed with finding Rosemary. He would report each night for his regular 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. shift, driving patrol and handling routine calls. In the short hours before dawn, he would collapse in exhaustion in his sparsely furnished apartment. Then, after a short, fitful sleep, he would drive around the corner to police headquarters to resume his search during the daytime. At least twice each day, Agnes Calandrello left her sickly husband at home and walked the 4 blocks to headquarters to inquire about her missing daughter. The visits always started and ended the same, with Calandrello blaming herself. If only she had not sent Rosemary for milk, she said. "Do you think she's still alive somewhere?" Guzzi didn't have the heart to say that he thought her daughter was dead. All the sergeant had been able to establish was that a Linden resident, Robert Zorinsky, was seen with Rosemary in his car the day she disappeared. So he had arrested Zorinsky on a charge of contributing to the delinquency of a minor. Zorinsky's parents posted the $10,000 bail and took their son back home before he ever set foot in a jail cell. But Guzzi's Calandrello case file was growing as thick as a dictionary. The sergeant had learned a lot about his prime suspect. Enough to convince him that Zorinsky, a week shy of his 29th birthday, was a dangerous predator who had slipped through the cracks of the criminal justice system many times. People in Linden had remembered the young man in white muscle shirts, tight black jeans, and pointed boots as a troublemaker and a mama's boy. He picked on weaker kids and backed away from people who stood up to him. Zorinsky was a mediocre student who graduated from Linden High School in 1958 and joined his father in the family business, delivering produce to restaurants and grocery stores in Middlesex and Monmouth counties. The Linden Police Department had a file on him bulging with papers documenting a history of mental problems and brushes with the law. As a teenager, Zorinsky threatened to blow up the home of a girl in town who had been forbidden by her parents to see him. At 21, he was caught setting fires and toppling 1,500 headstones in Rosedale Memorial Park in Linden. Police suspected he had help, but Zorinsky insisted he did the job alone. Zorinsky identified himself as Lieutenant Schaefer, leader of the American Republican Army, when he was arrested and charged with vandalizing the cemetery. This was the work of a person with a warped mind, Prosecutor H. Douglas Stein said at a press conference announcing the arrest. Zorinsky told the Linden police chief he was plotting to blow up a railroad junction in the heart of downtown Elizabeth. His goal, Zorinsky said, was to become king of New Jersey so he could control his girlfriend's family. Investigators were also able to identify him as the writer of letters to local newspapers, threatening to blow up Bellevue Hospital in New York City. After the cemetery vandalism, a judge committed Zorinsky to the Trenton State Mental Hospital for evaluation. Psychiatrists diagnosed him as paranoid schizophrenic. They said he suffered from delusions and hallucinations. One doctor wrote he should not be allowed to leave because he was dangerous. Zorinsky spent a year at Trenton State, where doctors ordered shock treatment. He was strapped to a gurney with electrodes attached to metal plates on both temples and a wedge placed between his teeth so he wouldn't bite his tongue. Bursts of electricity were delivered to his brain. When the cemetery case came to trial, Zorinsky pleaded insanity. At trial, it was revealed he'd been in and out of mental institutions since he was 14. After his year in the Trenton Hospital, Zorinsky changed like night and day, his father testified. He was calmer and more communicative, Julius Zorinsky said. Zorinsky's own psychiatrist, Morton Stern of Newark, testified Zorinsky was insane at the time of the crime, but in a state of remission. In a letter to the judge dated June 7, 1963, a psychiatrist who treated Zorinsky at the mental hospital agreed. However, there was always the probability of a recurrence of the psychotic symptoms, he wrote. Any situation of stress will tend to precipitate a relapse. Convicted on June 20, 1963, on charges that carried a maximum sentence of 3 years in prison, Zorinsky caught a surprising break. The judge sentenced him to 5 years probation. Once Zorinsky's probation was over, the police in his hometown heard little about him for the next year. Then Rosemary Calandrello walked to the store for a jug of milk and vanished. Guzzi had pieced together a chronology of events surrounding Rosemary's disappearance that left little doubt Zorinsky had abducted the shy Atlantic Highlands teenager. About 2 weeks before Rosemary was last seen, a stranger had tried to pick up two 14-year-olds outside the bowling alley in Atlantic Highlands. He offered the girls blackberry brandy and a chance to drive the car. The man looked to be in his late 20s, with fat sideburns and a chubby face, according to one of the girls, Darlene Curran. He appeared out of nowhere, she said. He pulled alongside us and asked, "Do you want to drive my car, and do you want a drink?" I said, "No, mister, And just 2 days before Rosemary's disappearance, 12-year-old friends Lydia Hardy and Robin Spangenberg, who lived one town away from Atlantic Highlands, had told Guzzi of their encounter with a scary man. Guzzi was struck by the details they remembered. "I live at 86 Center Avenue in Leonardo with my mommy and my daddy," Robin said. "Lydia and I were walking when a white car came up behind us. The driver said, 'Would you like a ride or would you rather walk?' The man," the girl said, had slicked back brown hair, big sideburns, and a small beard on his chin. He was husky, with a fat face and shiny eyes. Guzzi wondered why Rosemary's case had been different. How had Zorinsky gotten her into his car? The girl was afraid of her own shadow. Had he threatened her? Grabbed her and pulled her inside? Had anyone seen it? Several people had come forward to say they saw Rosemary right before she disappeared. Mary Ann Cochon, a neighbor, saw her walking toward the corner store. Rosemary was alone, Cochon said. Doreen Vaughn, who also lived in the neighborhood, had traveled the same route just a few minutes before Rosemary. Vaughn had a 6 p.m. appointment with the tax assessor that day. Her husband was late coming home with the car, so Vaughn decided to walk. Along the way, she saw a white convertible with a black ragtop parked near the bowling alley. The driver was slouched down, and the engine was running. No one else was around. Vaughn, being cautious, crossed the street. Rosemary, barefoot, with a pair of dollar bills stuffed in her shorts pocket, would have come along a few minutes later, about the time 4 classmates said they saw her in Zorinsky's car. The boys identified Zorinsky from photographs. Zorinsky had defied police orders and shaved his facial hair, but the boys recognized him anyway. They also identified his beat-up convertible as the one Rosemary had been riding in. As strong as the circumstantial case was, though, Rosemary was still officially a missing person, nothing more. Anyone who knew Rosemary said she would be the last person to ever run away from home, but Guzzi needed solid proof that she had met with foul play. Zorinsky was adamant about his innocence. "I didn't do it. I didn't take her. I didn't pick her up," he had told Guzzi. "Yeah, sure," the sergeant replied. Maybe Zorinsky's car would give him what he needed. The impounded 1961 Ford Galaxy convertible sat in an ambulance bay next to police headquarters in Atlantic Highlands. A team of forensics experts arrived at 9:30 a.m. on August 29th, 4 days after Rosemary's disappearance. It was an impressive bunch, Guzzi thought. John Anderson, chief chemist for the State Police Forensics Lab, 3 state police investigators, and a detective from the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office. The gloved examiner spent most of the day searching for hard evidence. 2 bottles of beer and a bottle of blackberry brandy were removed from the glove compartment. Hair clips were taken from under the front passenger seat. A pair of blue bikini panties, size 5, were found on the left rear floor. There were spots of blood on the bumper, but they were too spare to analyze. Someone directed Guzzi to the inside of the passenger door. The door latch and the window crank were missing. The car was a trap. A girl could get in, but she couldn't get out. Guzzi thought about the description of Rosemary from one of the last people to see her. She was seated completely against the passenger door of the car, her neighbor, Michael Hazeltine, had said, holding her glasses in her left hand. Guzzi knew that she must have realized right away that she couldn't get out. Guzzi's reflection was interrupted by the voice of one of the examiners. Vince Donahue of the state police was pointing inside the trunk. Guzzi spied a ball-peen hammer on the floor. Stuck to the flat surface of the hammerhead was a fiber that looked like a human hair. Using a pair of tweezers, Donahue plucked the fiber and carefully placed it into a plastic evidence bag. The fiber was sent off to a lab for testing, along with a sample of Rosemary's hair taken from her hairbrush at home. The call came from John Anderson, the state police chemist, a few days later. "The hair on the hammer is a human hair," Anderson said, "but it does not belong to Rosemary Calandrello." Because he felt a heaviness in his chest. The strongest piece of evidence in his investigation had just disappeared. He was convinced Zorinsky had taken Rosemary and killed her. He had been certain that tiny piece of physical evidence would turn a purely circumstantial case into a convincing argument for murder. Hanging up, Guzzi sank into his chair. He considered going home, climbing into bed, and pulling the covers over his head. He was exhausted. Instead, he picked up the phone and started calling colleagues from other police departments across the state, asking the same question over and over. "Do you have any missing girls?" Maybe Zorinsky would strike again, Guzzi thought. Maybe he had killed before.
Welcome back to Deadly Secrets, the untold story of a killer named Robert Zorinsky. Deadly Secrets is the product of more than a year of reporting by Robin Gaby Fisher and Judith Lucas of the Star-Ledger of Newark, New Jersey. It is narrated by Wallace Stroby.
Chapter 7. The River's Edge. The words were spoken so quickly that Sergeant Sam Guzzi almost missed what the detective said. Something about drag marks leading to the river? It was October 17th, 1969, 2 months after Guzzi began investigating the disappearance of a shy Atlantic Highlands teenager named Rosemary Calandrello. He had a suspect, a 29-year-old produce delivery man from Linden, and Guzzi was sure that the man, Robert Zorinsky, had killed her. But how could he prove murder without a body? Finding Rosemary, or finding out what had happened to her, had virtually consumed the 42-year-old detective. Atlantic Highlands had a small-town police department, so Guzzy worked his regular overnight shift, then spent the rest of his time chasing leads and calling colleagues in other towns, asking if they had any similar unsolved cases. Time after time, he got the same response. "Sorry, wish we could help, but..." Finally, a call to Woodbridge detective Steve Danch gave him the answer he was looking for. 5 months before Rosemary's disappearance, a pretty 17-year-old blonde, Linda Balabano, had left her job at Sobin's drugstore in Roselle at 5:30 p.m. Her routine was to walk 2 blocks to catch the bus home to Union, but she never made it to the bus. The day was March 26, 1969. A month after, a bloated body rose to the surface of the Raritan River in Woodbridge Township. It was dressed in the blue cotton blouse Balabano was wearing the day her parents reported her missing, but there was no clothing below the waist. Danch told Guzzy the girl had suffered terribly before she died. Her skull was cracked and her jaw was broken. A deep gash ran from the crown of her head to the bottom of her left earlobe. The medical examiner determined that she had been killed by a ferocious blow to her head. A piece of 16-gauge electrical wire had been knotted around her broken neck, and an 8-foot truck tire chain wrapped around her torso before the body entered the murky water. Her killer was still at large. Danch said the body was found snared under a dock near the Hess oil tanks. He later went back to the crime scene and noticed fresh marks in the dirt between the dock and a nearby road, as if something had recently been dragged over the ground. "Drag marks?" Guzzy asked. "When was that?" The detective checked his file. "August 26th, he said. Guzzy caught his breath. Rosemary Calandrello had disappeared the previous day. Guzzy quickly recited the details of the Calandrello case for the Woodbridge detective. Could it have been Rosemary's body that was dragged to the water's edge? Had Zorinsky killed both girls? There was one more thing, Danch said. Sobin's drugstore, where the Balbano girl was last seen, was 2 blocks from the border with Linden, where Zorinsky lived. In Guzzy's mind, an unmistakable pattern was emerging. So far, he'd been able to identify at least 3 teenage girls who had gone missing in the span of a few months. Jane Duryea, a 13-year-old from East Keansburg, had been sexually assaulted and bludgeoned to death on her way home from school in November of 1968. Her slaying was still unsolved. 4 months later, Linda Balabano was abducted near Zorinsky's home. She, too, had been brutally beaten. 5 months after that, Rosemary Calandrello vanished 5 miles from where Jane Duryea was killed. Several witnesses had seen Rosemary in Zorinsky's Ford convertible the day she disappeared. Around the same time, 4 other young girls claimed a stranger matching Zorinsky's description had tried to lure them into his car. "I think we have a serial killer on our hands," Guzzy said. Guzzy hung up the phone and called Sergeant George Justin, the captain of the state police dive team. "I need your help," he said. A team of divers plunged into the chilly waters of the Raritan River the following week. For 2 days, while Guzzy watched from the dock, troopers dressed in black scuba gear searched the waters around the Hess oil tanks for the remains of Rosemary Calandrello. At the end of the second day, Justin approached Guzzy with the grim conclusion. The divers had given it their best shot, but the water was black and fetid, making it impossible for them to see anything. If Rosemary's body were there, the chances of finding it were remote. Disappointed, but undeterred, Guzzy approached the prosecutor's office in his home county with his theory about a serial killer. But even though his file brimmed with evidence indicating Zorinsky was preying on young girls, no one in the office in Freehold showed much interest in pursuing the case. The Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office in 1969 consisted of a part-time prosecutor, Vincent Cooper, and 8 part-time attorneys who some thought were more interested in building their private practices than prosecuting criminals for the county. In the absence of a full-time prosecutor, the office was run by the chief of detectives, John Gawler. Local cops knew better than to turn to Gawler for assistance. When they did succeed in reaching him, he invariably said he was understaffed and overworked. Trying to get to Cooper through Gawler, Guzzi found, was an even greater challenge. At the time Guzzi was trying to get its attention, the prosecutor's office had significant problems of its own. The State Commission of Investigations was looking into the disappearance of tens of thousands of dollars from a fund used to pay underworld informants. Gawler, who controlled the fund, was the prime suspect, and Cooper was being questioned about how much attention he was paying to the workings of his office. Just a week after Guzzi sketched a possible connection between the Calandrello and Balbano case, Gawler, subpoenaed to testify before the commission, committed suicide. Shortly afterwards, Governor Richard Hughes ordered the state attorney general to take control of Cooper's office. Guzzi would have to look elsewhere for help. Fed up, he decided that if Cooper didn't have time for him, he would pack up his files and drive to Trenton to present his case to someone in the attorney general's office. With his chief's blessing, he did just that. Edwin Steer agreed to see Guzzi when the detective arrived with the Calandrello file tucked under his arm. Steer, an assistant attorney general in charge of investigating organized crime and corruption, had been appointed to look into the goings-on in the Monmouth County prosecutor's office. He knew the place was unraveling and important cases were being neglected. The two men sat in Steer's office for hours. Steer impressed Guzzi as professional and attentive. In turn, Steer admired Guzzi's dedication. After reviewing the file, Steer was convinced Zorinsky was indeed a danger. Making a case for murder would require more work, Steer told Guzzi, but he would pressure Cooper to pursue two lesser charges against Zorinsky. It would be a way to keep Zorinsky out of circulation while they tried to build a stronger case. Rosemary Calandrello had been gone 3 months when, the week before Thanksgiving in 1969, Zorinsky was indicted on charges of attempting to kidnap Lydia Hardy and Robin Spangenberg, two 12-year-olds from Leonardo, who said he had tried to entice them into his car August 23rd, or 2 days before Rosemary disappeared. Zorinsky was arrested on a Saturday at his home and held in the Monmouth County Jail on $10,000 bail. A second indictment quickly followed, charging him with the attempted kidnapping of Darlene Curran and Donna Johnson, both 14, on August 9th outside a bowling alley in neighboring Atlantic Highlands. His bail was increased to $70,000. Guzzi was elated. He called Steer to thank him for lighting a fire under the prosecutor. The indictments would take Zorinsky off the streets, at least for a while. In the meantime, Guzzi would step up his efforts to prove that Zorinsky had killed Rosemary. In Woodbridge, newspaper stories about the arrest of Robert Zorinsky startled 25-year-old Vinnie Simone. His 23-year-old girlfriend had recently confided that a man with the same name had viciously attacked her about 7 years earlier. Until then, his girlfriend, Sharon Kennedy, had never told a soul. Simone eventually persuaded her to contact the Atlantic Highlands police and tell the story she had kept to herself for so long. Guzzi took the call, and a few hours later he drove to Linden. He picked up Kennedy a short distance from her home, so her parents wouldn't see. He noticed she trembled as she told how she had encountered Zorinsky at the municipal swimming pool during the summer of 1961 when she was 15. She quietly related how Zorinsky pulled up in his white Ford convertible and offered a ride to her and two friends. He dropped off the others, she said, then drove her against her will to a remote area in Atlantic Highlands where he attacked her. Kennedy had remained silent all these years out of fear Zorinsky might otherwise come back for her. Now she wanted to help, but only if Guzzi promised not to let her parents know what happened. She would tell the story once, she said, and never again. Guzzi knew too much time had passed to charge Zorinsky with assaulting Kennedy, but her account helped the circumstantial case he was building, and he was taken by a key detail. Kennedy said Zorinsky wanted her to beg for her life, but she spat in his face. She told Guzzi that she believed that if she'd obeyed, he would have killed her. Guzzi thought about Rosemary Calandrello. Her mother had said Rosemary always did as she was told. "We have to get Bob out of jail," Veronica Zorinsky told her relatives after her son's arrest. They offered up their houses as collateral to meet the $70,000 bail, and they brought Veronica's boy home in time for Christmas. Before his release, Zirinsky was ordered to undergo psychiatric testing. I cannot help intuitively feeling that this man does not show guilt, regret, or remorse, psychiatrist Antonio DeLise wrote in a 5-page report. Clinically, the personality of this man is more psychopathic than a schizophrenic paranoid. Zirinsky was released on bail nonetheless. He spent the holidays at home watching television and drinking more than usual. The more he drank, the more menacing he became, constantly berating his wife and his father. One night, Lynn Zirinsky found the nerve to pose the question she'd wanted to ask for months. "You don't have anything to do with this Rosemary Calandrello thing, do you?" "Don't ever bring that up again," Zirinsky said, storming out of the house. Over the next few months, Zirinsky went about his business, delivering produce with his father during the day and doing whatever he did at night. No one in his family seemed to know, and they certainly didn't ask. The trial in the matter of State of New Jersey versus Robert Zirinsky, indictment number 26569, began and ended with little notice in early March 1970. Lynn accompanied her husband to his trial for the attempted kidnapping of the two 12-year-olds from Leonardo. She sat behind him, ever the loyal wife. The prosecution presented its case over 3 days, and then Zirinsky's attorney, Richard Plechner, moved for a mistrial, saying the state had not proved its case. Monmouth County Judge George A. Gray agreed. Having heard the testimony of the investigating detectives, the judge ruled the state had failed to show that Zirinsky intended to kidnap the girls. It was possible he was just offering them a ride, the judge said. The trial was over. Still, the judge seemed loath to let Zirinsky go. "I do so with grave reluctance," Gray said from the bench. "I am convinced the defendant stands before this court right now as a nucleus of many evils. I feel that something should be done with this man. However, we live in a government of law and not of men." Zirinsky hardly had time to catch his breath before going to trial again for the alleged attempted kidnapping of the two 14-year-olds outside the bowling alley at Atlantic Highlands. A large family contingent sat behind him in the courtroom in Freehold. Donna Johnson, a small girl with a weak voice, held up well on direct examination by Assistant Prosecutor Thomas J. Smith, Jr. "He asked us if we smoked and we said yes," she testified. "He asked us if we drank and we laughed, so we said yes. Then he says, 'Well, we can go drinking and you can get some of your friends and I'll get some of my friends from Keensburg.'" Darlene Curran seemed even more timid, and Zirinsky's attorney approached her gingerly during the cross-examination. "Had Zirinsky attempted to force her or Johnson into his car?" Plechner asked. "No," Curran said. "He had not used any obscenities or dirty language or anything offensive," she said. "You know, he just seemed like a pain to me." Smith gave an impassioned closing. "Last night I read The Pied Piper of Hamelin. Haven't read it in a long time," he said, pacing back and forth in front of the jury. "This is a Pied Piper," he said, pointing at Zirinsky. "Thank God these little girls had the strength of character to say, 'No, I'm not going to go drinking with you.' Suppose they didn't. What was in this man's mind?" The jury began its deliberations at 11 a.m. and reached a guilty verdict before lunch. In sentencing Zirinsky on May 29th, Judge Patrick J. McGann said, "You are a married man, at the time 29 years of age, living in Linden. What are you doing down in Atlantic Highlands? Wandering around? And why do you stop to talk to two little girls?" And they were little girls. They looked their age. Zirinsky was sentenced to 5 to 7 years in prison, but was allowed to go home pending his appeal. Once again, he caught a break. In February 1971, an appeals court reversed the jury verdict. Zirinsky's offer to give the girls a ride was not enough to support the jury's conclusion, the court ruled. "All that appears is a casual conversation between defendant and the two girls," the judges wrote. A detective from the prosecutor's office called Guzzi with the news. "You won't believe this," he began. Guzzi slammed his fist on his desk. It was 18 months since Rosemary Calandrello had gone missing, and he was no closer to proving Zirinsky had killed her. Meantime, the Middlesex County authorities had come up with nothing to link Zirinsky to the death of Linda Balbano. "Another wall," Guzzi said. "This whole damn thing has been nothing but walls. Chapter 8. Fears Fulfilled. The new technology was something called neutron activation. It could solve crimes through microscopic analysis of bits of hair, according to the lecturer at the State Police Academy in Seagirt. Sergeant Sam Guzzi scribbled notes as fast as he could guide his pen across the paper. A human hair had been found a couple of years earlier on a hammer in the car of Linden resident Robert Zirinsky. A police chemist determined it did not belong to Rosemary Calandrello, the 17-year-old girl from Guzzistown who had vanished in the summer of 1969 on the way to the store for milk. Now the hair lay inside the Atlantic Highlands Police Headquarters, sealed in a brown evidence envelope. It was November 17th, 1971. Guzzi had labored mightily to prove Zirinsky killed Rosemary. While the circumstantial case was powerful, Guzzi was finally convinced that, without Rosemary's body, the case would never go to court. But if the encouraging new science could tie Zirinsky to another case, one in which a body had been found. Back in his office, Guzzi telephoned the prosecutor's office in neighboring Middlesex County, where the body of 17-year-old Linda Balabano had been discovered in the Raritan River. She had been brutally killed 5 months before Rosemary's disappearance. "Do you have a sample of Linda Balabano's hair?" Guzzi asked the detective who took his call. "Can you get one?" "It was almost 3 years ago," the detective said. "Please," Guzzi insisted, "try." Life had all but stopped for the Balabano family when Linda died. Her grief-stricken parents, Paul and Peggy, did little else but reflect on their loss. A detective went to their home to retrieve a hair sample and found that 2 years and 8 months after Linda's death, her bedroom still looked as if she were expected home at any moment. Her clothes hung neatly in the closet, and her guitar stood in the corner. Her hairbrush lay on top of the dresser, right where she set it down on the last morning of her life. Strands of blonde hair were coiled around its bristles. The hair sample was packaged and delivered to a lab in Washington, D.C. for neutron activation testing on December 10, 1971. The report, signed by C. Michael Hoffman, Acting Chief Forensic Staff, Division of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, came back a month later. It read, Forensic Lab Sample 31974, hair from Linda Balabano, and Forensic Lab Sample 31975, hair from the ball-peen hammer, have a high degree of similarity. Guzzi called Hoffman to make sure he understood. "Does this mean what I think it means?" Guzzi asked. "It's a match," said Hoffman. Guzzi felt as if he'd hit the lottery. Guzzi folded the report, slipped it into an envelope, and drove 30 miles to deliver it by hand to the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office in New Brunswick. When he arrived, Guzzi gave the lab results to C. Judd Hamlin, a former public defender who had been named first assistant prosecutor the previous spring. Hamlin oversaw a busy office of 35 prosecutors, and that year he was juggling 21 murder cases and 4,000 indictments. In the Balabano case, Hamlin wanted corroborating evidence. Hair analyses in the early 1970s were considered reliable enough to exclude subjects, but not to convict them. Until investigators in his office could find an eyewitness, an accomplice, or additional forensic evidence, Hamlin wouldn't consider a murder charge against Zirinsky. "We'll take a look at it," was the only guarantee he could give the cop from the next county. 2 years went by. During that time, Guzzi, now a captain, checked in periodically with the detectives assigned to the Balabano case. Each time he was told the same thing. "We're working on it." Meanwhile, Agnes Calandrello, her hair grayer and her face gaunt from years of not knowing what happened to her daughter, called Guzzi every day. He did not know what to say anymore. What could he say? "Agnes, we're working on it." Guzzi was positive Zirinsky would strike again. But where? When? In the file was a report from a psychiatrist who had examined Zirinsky in 1963. "We do not believe schizophrenics ever recover," it read. "Sometimes they go into periods of remission. However, there is always the problem of recurrence of the psychotic symptoms and abnormal behavior. Remission may be short or lengthy." "He'll kill again," Guzzi would tell his fellow cops. It's only a matter of time. Then, on December 13th, 1974, two teenage girls went missing in Woodbridge in Middlesex County, the township where Linda Balbano's body had been found, 5 miles from where Zorinsky lived with his parents and wife. Joanne Delardo and Doreen Carlucci were last seen on that Friday night, 12 days before Christmas, on their way home from a dance at a Catholic youth center. A witness saw the girls walking along a busy avenue around 10 p.m. They had come from a neighborhood dairy store and were eating ice cream cones and chattering away. John Delardo had dropped off his 15-year-old daughter and her 13-year-old friend at the dance. He was supposed to pick them up, but he went home and fell asleep on the couch, and the girls never called for a ride. At midnight, Delardo's wife, Jeanette, woke him up. "Joanne's not home yet," she said. Delardo got in the car and drove all over town looking for the girls. Maybe they had gotten a ride with friends and forgotten the time. Maybe they had met up with Joanne's brother, Johnny, and gone to a late movie. The girls were always saying they were bored. There was nothing to do in Woodbridge. At 4:55 a.m., the Delardos and the Carluccis reported their children missing. The rest of that weekend, scores of neighbors and other volunteers joined the search. A reward was offered for information leading to their safe return. 2 weeks later, on December 27th, a cyclist discovered the girls' bodies along a remote country lane 30 miles away in Manalapan Township in Monmouth County. They had been badly beaten around the head and shoulders. Delardo's body was naked from the waist down, just as Linda Balbano's had been. Carlucci's body was almost entirely nude, yet police told their families there was no evidence of sexual assault on either girl. Both had been strangled, and like Balbano, the Delardo girl still had black electrical cord knotted around her neck. When he heard, Guzzi said, "Zorinsky." Chapter 9. End Run. Malcolm Carton sat at a table in the Woodbridge Police Department, his sandwich untouched. On the table were grainy black and white photographs of two mutilated teenagers, Joanne Delardo and Doreen Carlucci. Carton felt sick and angry. The bodies of the two Woodbridge girls had been found along a quiet country lane in Manalapan Township 2 days after Christmas, 1974. Monmouth County Prosecutor James Coleman assigned Carton, an ambitious young lawyer, to head up a team investigating the killings. Jack Mullaney, another young prosecutor, accompanied Carton to the meeting in Woodbridge, as did Andy Manning, the county's chief of detectives. 2 state troopers and a Woodbridge police detective joined them at the table, looking for links to other unsolved cases. Carton studied the crime scene pictures of the dead girls. Delardo and Carlucci had been beaten mercilessly. Delardo had been garroted with black electrical wire. Carlucci's body was almost entirely nude, and Delardo was naked from the waist down. "Whoever did this needs to be found and stopped," Carton said. "We're dealing with a monster here." Carton reached for a pile of cold case files stacked on the side of the table. One was a yellowed manila folder thick with notes of interviews and leads that hadn't panned out. "Have you looked at the Calandrello case?" one of the troopers asked. A few days later, Carton and Mullaney were in the Atlantic Highlands Police Department office of Captain Sam Guzzi, the cop who for more than 5 years had pursued the killer of Rosemary Calandrello. Carton got right to the point. Too many teenage girls were missing or dead, and the slayings bore striking similarities. Could they see Guzzi's file on the Calandrello investigation? For 2 days, Carton and Mullaney locked themselves in an office and pored over Guzzi's voluminous records. Again and again, the evidence pointed to Guzzi's prime suspect in the Calandrello case, a man named Robert Zorinsky. Rosemary Calandrello had disappeared from Atlantic Highlands on August 25, 1969, on her way to the corner store. 4 boys who knew the shy 17-year-old gave statements saying they saw Rosemary that day with a man they identified as Zorinsky. 5 months before that, in March of 1969, a girl named Linda Balbano, also 17, disappeared after leaving her job at a drugstore just blocks from Zorinsky's home in Linden. Her body was found floating in the Raritan River. She had been slain in much the same fashion as Delardo and Carlucci, and her body, like Delardo's, had electrical wire knotted around her broken neck. 4 months before Balbano's slaying, a 13-year-old named Jane Duryea was found bludgeoned to death in Keensburg, less than 3 miles from Atlantic Highlands. And there were the reports from girls who claimed Zorinsky had tried to get them into his car, and the girl from his hometown who described a brutal sexual assault years earlier in the summer of 1961. Guzzi had documented every aspect of the Calandrello case. He had kept a log of every telephone call he had made or received, typed up a synopsis of every conversation he engaged in, copied every interview transcript, and cut out every newspaper story that might have any link to the case. At the end of the second day, the lawyers emerged from the office looking weary but determined. "We think we have a serial killer on our hands," Mulaney said, "and we think we have a case against Robert Zorinsky for the murder of Rosemary Calandrello." Witnesses had seen Zorinsky with Rosemary on the day she disappeared. They had picked him out of a lineup and described his Ford convertible perfectly. Rosemary's body had never been found, but she had never been seen alive again either. "That part will be a challenge," Carton said, "but someone has to stand up and knock the train off the track. Someone has to stop this guy." The Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office of 1975 was not the same place it had been in 1969, when Guzzi had first raised his concerns about Zorinsky. The prosecutor, Vincent Cooper, had been replaced in 1972 by Coleman, picked by incoming Republican Governor William Cahill to be the county's first full-time prosecutor. Chippy Coleman, as he was known, 48, had quickly set out to transform the image of the office, mired in scandal under his Democratic predecessor. Coleman wanted to be known as the guy who brought law and order back to the office. He beefed up the staff, beginning with a 31-year-old Carton, a Seton Hall Law School graduate who had been his aide when he was a state assemblyman. Both men had healthy egos, and while they respected each other, their relationship was sometimes contentious. The Calandrello murder case quickly became an obsession for Carton, and a source of friction between the eager young first assistant and Coleman. Coleman insisted on being the one who presented cases to the grand jury. When Carton initially filled him in on the details of the case, shortly after meeting with Guzzi, Coleman recited a list of reasons why he thought it was a loser. No New Jersey prosecutor had ever gotten a murder conviction without a body, he said, and he did not like the odds of becoming the first. Even if he was willing to present the circumstantial case to a grand jury, he pointed out, too much time had passed to charge Zorinsky with murdering the Calandrello girl. The interpretation of New Jersey's statute of limitations accepted by most lawyers, Coleman said, was that a suspect had to be charged within 5 years of a crime. Rosemary had been missing for 5.5 years. During one of his tense meetings with his boss, Carton admitted the case had serious problems. "But I also know we are dealing with a serial killer," he said, "and if someone doesn't stop him, he's going to keep killing." Coleman remained unconvinced, and he made it clear he expected Carton to drop the case. But Carton would not be warned off so easily. One of Carton's primary responsibilities as first assistant was assigning cases. Without telling Coleman, he had assigned Jack Mulaney to work the Calandrello case with him full-time. The two made an interesting pair. Mulaney was intense and street-smart with a Brooklyn swagger. His hair was long and his suits were usually rumpled. He had a wife and a brood of kids. Carton was still single and wouldn't be caught dead in wrinkled clothes. He favored tweed jackets and loafers with tassels. Both were convinced they could get a grand jury to indict Zorinsky for the murder of the 17-year-old Atlantic Highlands girl. They felt they had no choice. It was the strongest case they had against him. They would worry about Rosemary's missing body and the statute of limitations later. Trying to stay off Coleman's radar screen, they went about cobbling together the evidence, often working long after everyone else went home. They re-interviewed witnesses and retraced Rosemary's steps on the day she disappeared. They spent time getting to know her family and studied everything they had on Zorinsky. "What we're doing is high risk," Mulaney said to Carton during one of their many long discussions, out of Coleman's earshot. "I know," Carton said, "but I took an oath, and I know Zorinsky is a serial killer. There's no turning back." For weeks, Coleman didn't ask what they were doing. Then, in late January, Carton found a note taped to his office telephone, and it got straight to the point. "Whatever you and Mulaney are up to, I would like to know about it." Carton looked at the piece of paper, crumpled it, and tossed it away. Coleman, to Carton's surprise, didn't ask again. The prosecutor planned a business trip for the second week of February 1975. Carton scheduled his grand jury presentation for the same week. People in the office gasped when they heard. "This could cost you your job," they told him. "So be it," Carton replied. The hearing took place in the grand jury room at the Monmouth County Courthouse in Freehold. Carton felt confident about the outcome. He and Mullaney had thoroughly prepared the case. Mullaney watched as Carton presented it to the 23 people on the panel. Guzzi testified, followed by the 4 boys from Atlantic Highlands who saw Rosemary in Zorinsky's car on the day she disappeared. Their testimony about seeing the timid girl with the older stranger chilled even Carton, and he noticed the jurors seemed spellbound. Their mouths hung open as they listened to all the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. To charge Zorinsky with Rosemary Calandrello's murder, 12 of the 23 would have to vote to indict him. The vote was unanimous. "I wish I could see Zorinsky's face when he finds out," Carton thought. And Coleman, how would he take the news? Coleman returned from his trip just in time for the announcement of indictment number 58674, charging Zorinsky with the 1969 murder of Rosemary Calandrello. The prosecutor was fit to be tied. Who did Carton think he was, usurping Coleman's authority? Carton had crossed the line, and Coleman let him know it. "The indictment will be dismissed," Coleman said after taking Carton aside, "and if by some miracle it isn't, and the case goes to trial, you'll never get a conviction." Carton nodded. "You're probably right," he said. "But," Carton thought, "I'm sure as hell going to try." Chapter 10. Murder Trial. Rosemary Calandrello's mother shook as she took her seat on the witness stand. Her daughter's disappearance had taken an obvious toll on Agnes Calandrello. She was frail, having lost almost half her body weight in the 6 years Rosemary had been gone. Her face was creased with worry lines, and her eyes had a lifeless glaze. Seated at the defense table no more than 10 feet away, Robert Zorinsky, the man accused of murdering the teenager from Atlantic Highlands, stared at Calandrello with a look of indifference. His mother, Veronica, sat behind him, her hair sprayed into a perfect bouffant. The State of New Jersey versus Robert Zorinsky began April 7, 1975, 6 weeks after the grand jury handed up a murder indictment. Agnes Calandrello spent half the morning talking about her daughter. She said Rosemary had been sheltered, probably too much so. "Because she was my only daughter," she said, "and I guess I kept her too much to myself." "She was a good girl," Agnes said. "She never gave her parents any trouble. She didn't smoke or drink and had just begun dating a young man, her first boyfriend." Monmouth County Assistant Prosecutor Jack Mullaney was known for his energetic presence in the courtroom. He usually spoke loudly and walked at such a frenetic pace that his tie flew over his shoulder. But with his first witness, he took things slow. Mullaney reached into a box on the floor and pulled out an envelope. "Mrs. Calandrello," he said, emptying the contents of the envelope into his hand and holding it out to the mother. "Can you identify those 2 hair clips?" "Yes, sir," she said. "Rosemary had quite a few of them. She used them to make little side curls." The 2 hair clips had been found in Zorinsky's Ford Galaxy convertible. "Do you know if she had these types of clips in her hair when she left home?" he asked. "Well, Mr. Mullaney," said Rosemary's mother, trying to keep her composure, "she says at 6 o'clock I'll go upstairs and comb my hair. Now, I really believe that she had her hair pushed back with the 2 clips, but I'm not 100% sure." Mullaney presented the only other piece of physical evidence that could link Zorinsky to Rosemary, a pair of blue bikini underpants found on the floor of the back seat of Zorinsky's car. "Could they have belonged to Rosemary?" Mullaney asked. Calandrello said she could not be certain. "Rosemary owned different kinds of underwear," she explained. "She chose her own clothes to wear that day," she said. First Assistant Prosecutor Malcolm Carton, who had secured the indictment against Zorinsky, chose to watch the trial from the front row of Judge M. Raymond McGowan's courtroom in Freehold. Carton's boss, Monmouth County Prosecutor James Coleman, monitored the proceedings from his office. The indictment had not changed his mind about the case, which he believed was hopelessly weak. But he quietly admired the zeal of his young prosecutors. Over the next few days, Mullaney called witnesses who traced Rosemary's last steps. Sam Guzzi of the Atlantic Highlands Police Department, who built the case against Zorinsky, painstakingly described the statements he had gathered from local residents who had seen Rosemary the day she disappeared. The strongest testimony came from 4 boys who said she'd been sitting in a beat-up white convertible shortly after she left home. "Do you see the person in this courtroom who drove that car?" Mullaney asked Tom Gowers, who lived across the street from the Calandrellos. "Yes, I do," Gowers said. "Can you point him out, please?" "He's right there," Gowers said, pointing at Zorinsky. "He's wearing a yellow shirt and, well, he's sitting right next to the defense attorney." The 34-year-old defendant never flinched. Not even later, when 2 former prison cellmates took the stand with damning stories to tell. In November of 1969, Zorinsky had been indicted on charges of attempting to kidnap 2 12-year-old girls from Leonardo, and again on charges of trying to entice a pair of teenagers from Atlantic Highlands into his car. He would escape conviction in both cases, but in the meantime he briefly shared a cell block at the Monmouth County Jail with John Gosch, Jr. Guzzi had secretly arranged for Zorinsky to be placed near Gosch, who had agreed to spy on him in return for possible leniency on a bad check charge. "Don't question him," Guzzi instructed Gosch, "but if he says anything, let us know." According to Gosch, Zorinsky had plenty to say. One day, Gosch testified, Zorinsky went to court to try to have his bail reduced. He was counting on going home, but the judge denied the request. When he came back from court, he was mad, Gosch testified. He made the statement, "They'll never find that stinking broad." Another cellmate, Herbert Williams, testified he had witnessed the same scene. "Did he do anything when he came back to the tier?" Mullaney asked. "He said they wouldn't find the girl's body," Williams said. "He said he threw it from a bridge with weights on, bricks on, or something. He threw it in a river." After 8 days of testimony, the prosecution rested its case. Mullaney looked as if he hadn't slept. His eyes were heavy, and he slouched in his chair. Richard Plechner stood and gathered himself, ready to begin his defense. Zorinsky's attorney was as plodding as Mullaney was animated. All 7 of his witnesses were Zorinsky's relatives, and their testimony seemed rehearsed. At 6 p.m. on August 25, 1969, when Rosemary Calandrello disappeared from Atlantic Highlands, Robert was 30 miles away at home with his family in Linden, they said. Veronica Zorinsky had been home all day with Robert's wife, Lynn, she said. Robert and her husband, Julius, had delivered produce for the family's wholesale business. They got home around 5 p.m. Veronica had dinner ready, as usual. She left for bingo at a local church at around 6:30. "And who was home when you left?" Plechner asked. "Well," said Veronica Zorinsky, "Lynn was home. She was in the kitchen, I think, reading or something. My husband was watching the news, eyewitness news." "Where was your son Robert?" asked Plechner. "He was in his room." "And did you see him?" "Yes, I did." Julius Zorinsky corroborated his wife's story, as did an array of aunts and uncles who claimed they saw Robert at home that night. Lynn Zorinsky added an explanation for the incriminating blue bikini panties found in his car. "They are mine," the petite brunette said. "I left those in the car when I'd gone down to my sister's swimming. I would throw my clothes in the back of the car. I remember missing a pair of them, but apparently they fell on the floor or something, because I know they're mine." The hair clips, the ones Agnes Calandrello had said looked exactly like the ones her daughter wore, were probably hers too, Lynn Zorinsky said. If convicted of murder, Robert Zorinsky would face a maximum sentence of life in prison. Still, he was confident he would drive back to Linden when the trial ended, a free man. On the day of closing arguments, 2 weeks after the trial began, he told his wife he was sure he would be home in time for supper. The courtroom was packed with spectators. Guzzi sat with Carton and with Rosemary's 3 brothers in the front row. The mother and brother of Linda Balabano, a teenager from Union killed 5 months before Rosemary's disappearance, sat behind them. Like Guzzi, the Balabanos were convinced Zorinsky had killed Linda, but he had never been charged. Zorinsky's wife and parents gathered on the opposite side of the courtroom. Zorinsky stared straight ahead as his attorney recounted the testimony of the defense witnesses. Incidentally, all either relatives or in-laws of the defendant, Plechner admitted. There was a good reason for that, Pluckner explained. This is a Monday night around supper time, he said, and on a Monday night around supper time, who would be your alibi witnesses? The witnesses all said Zorinsky was at home on the night Rosemary Calandrello disappeared. So how could he have killed her? We don't know where Rosemary Calandrello is, Pluckner said. We wish we did. We wish we could bring her into court here to testify for us. We hope she is well. We hope she did like many, many girls have done in recent years, and that is left home for reasons only known to her. Pluckner's summation took most of the morning. Some of the jurors looked drowsy. The judge called for a 5-minute recess. Then it was Mullaney's turn. The rookie assistant prosecutor focused on the thorny issue of Rosemary's body never being found. Is Rosemary Calandrello dead? He asked. Rosemary left the house barefoot, with a pair of shorts on and a top, $2 in her pocket. Rosemary is the girl who was never out of the house at night, never hung around bowling alleys or street corners, never got in strange cars. The defendant lay in wait, Mullaney declared, waiting for his prey. The tension in the courtroom built with Mullaney's every word. Mullaney turned toward the Zorinsky family. He could barely contain his disgust. The defense in this case has brought in somebody to try to explain every single piece of incriminating evidence, he said, raising his voice. Liars, he shouted, pounding his fist on the table. That's what they are. Liars. Carton suppressed a satisfied smile. He had watched Mullaney practice the summation, and now, when it counted, he had executed it perfectly. Mullaney's words were echoing in the courtroom as the jury of 6 men and 6 women began deliberations. 6 hours later, at 5:36 p.m., they sent word to Judge McGowan that they had reached a verdict. As the jurors filed into the courtroom, Zorinsky straddled his chair sideways and stared into their faces. Ladies and gentlemen, have you agreed upon a verdict? The court clerk asked when all the jurors were seated. We have, the jury foreman said. What is your verdict? Guilty of murder in the first degree. Sam Guzzi heard the words and broke down in tears. For 6 years, he had waited for this moment. He glanced over at Agnes Calandrello, seated nearby. She looked numb. Zorinsky turned to look at his mother, then shifted back in his chair and bowed his head slightly. The statutory penalty is mandatory, Judge McGowan said. There is no reason to delay sentencing. I think I will sentence the defendant right now. Pluckner asked for more time. Sentencings rarely took place immediately following a verdict, but the judge was adamant. Zorinsky stood, his muscled shoulders slumped forward. Is there anything you wish to say to me before I pronounce sentence? The judge asked. All I can say, Your Honor, I'm an innocent man, Zorinsky said flatly. I have been found guilty, and I really am not guilty. Believe me. Imposing a life sentence, Judge McGowan revoked bail. 7 armed guards surrounded Zorinsky, one snapping a pair of handcuffs over his wrists. Watching as Zorinsky was led out of the courtroom, Carton suppressed a smile. He had taken a huge risk in bringing the Calandrello case to trial, and he felt vindicated by the jury's verdict. Still, his excitement was tempered by his knowledge of New Jersey's sentencing guidelines, which he understood better than most. Zorinsky was 34 years old. Under the law, he would be required to serve 14 years and 9 months before becoming eligible for parole. If everything went his way, he could be out at age 49. Chapter 11. The Husband's Grip. An excerpt from the Psychological Evaluation for Parole for Robert Zorinsky, inmate number 56449, in prison since 1975. Clinical interview completed April 16, 1989. Psychological testing completed March 9, 1989. Mr. Zorinsky is a married white male currently serving a life sentence for murder. Institutional records indicate a model inmate with no institutional charges since incarceration. Mr. Zorinsky presented as neatly groomed, polite, and well-oriented. Stated mood was, quote, I'm all right emotionally, unquote. Affect was flat, and Mr. Zorinsky remained expressionless until he smiled at the end of the interview, asking, quote, is this the oddest case you've ever worked with, unquote. Clinical impression is of a schizoid, emotionally detached individual with a continued potential for decompensation and erratic behavior. He does appear to experience sincere guilt for his behavior. He has no awareness of the powerful rage he harbors within, and presents as a rigid, overly controlled, robotic individual who massively represses his emotional life. Lynn Zorinsky crept up the stairs and through the front door. It was almost midnight. She should have been home hours ago. Her husband's attorney had invited her to his office Christmas party, and she lost track of time. She hoped her mother-in-law did not hear her key in the lock. In the decade and a half since Robert Zorinsky was found guilty of murdering Rosemary Calandrello, Lynn had been a loyal wife. Her 20s and half of her 30s had passed by in a whirlwind of prison visits, legwork for legal appeals, and whatever else it took to satisfy her demanding husband. Zorinsky was in state prison, but he would be eligible for parole in a matter of months. Even if he was denied, he would be entitled to go before the parole board periodically for review. Eventually, he promised, he would be home. Zorinsky's control over his family was as strong as ever. He could no longer intimidate Lynn with his clenched fists, but his emotional grip had tightened to the point where she feared him even more than before his conviction. For the first years after Zorinsky went away in 1975, Lynn rarely left the house she shared with her in-laws in Linden. She depended on Robert's mother, Veronica, to drive, to cook, and to keep her company. But after her father-in-law Julius died in 1978, and the family's wholesale produce business went under, Lynn got permission from Zorinsky to get a driver's license and a job so she could help his mother with the bills. He needed a place to come home to, he said. When Lynn started work at a local electronics company, Robert ordered Veronica to keep a close eye on her. His mother was happy to oblige. Robert called Lynn before she left for work in the morning, and he called within minutes of her return home. Then he called all evening, every time he could get to the phone, until the prisons shut off the phones at 9 p.m. If Lynn did not answer by the second or third ring, Robert called downstairs to his mother to find out why. Lynn ran away once. It was 1983, and she was working at a pharmaceutical company. She left for work one morning and moved into a trailer home in another town. Within 2 weeks, Robert had her telephone number and address. My friend from the law library was paroled on a second-degree murder conviction, Zorinsky wrote to Lynn, and he was living with some woman in the Carteret Mobile Park. I got his phone number and told him that you were living in J16. For 2 cartons of cigarettes, he said, he could hire 2 ex-cons to bash in her head with a baseball bat. Lynn could not live like that. She moved back with her mother-in-law and settled quickly into her old routines. Trying not to make any noise as she headed up the stairs to her bedroom, Lynn heard movement in the kitchen. Her mother-in-law had waited up. "Lynn," she yelled, "is that you?" Lynn backtracked down the stairs and walked into the kitchen. Veronica Zorinsky looked crazed. Bob had called 5 or 6 times, she said. He was frantic because he could not reach her. "I'm sorry," Lynn said, trying to appease her. "The time got away from me. I didn't realize—" "You're the reason my Bob's in prison," Veronica screamed. "Everything went wrong after you came into our life." Lynn took a step back. "Damn you!" Veronica cried, punching Lynn with the same fury that Robert once had. Lynn stared into her mother-in-law's cold blue eyes and saw Robert. "That was for Bob," Veronica said, then turned and left the room. That night, Lynn Zorinsky said a prayer. "Dear God, forgive me. I'm tired. I cannot do this anymore." She gathered a handful of antidepressants and sleeping pills the doctor had prescribed years earlier after little Bobby died. The pills went down with 1 swallow. Lynn lay down on her bed and thought about her life. Except for the 2 years she had with her son before he died of complications from asthma, it had hardly been worth living. She had done a lot of thinking after Robert was arrested. He had stalked young girls and killed the Calandrello girl just as the police said. She was sure of it. No one knew better than Lynn what a monster Robert could be. As she began to lose consciousness, Lynn admitted to herself what she had never admitted to anyone. She had perjured herself on the witness stand in the Calandrello trial. She had felt she had no choice. Robert had not been home the night Rosemary Calandrello disappeared, as she had testified he was. Lynn remembered him picking a fight with her, or maybe with his father, and storming out of the house. The underwear found in the back seat of the convertible had probably belonged to the girl. Despite Robert's prompting and her subsequent testimony, Lynn did not recall ever changing her clothes in the car, and the bikini underpants presented as evidence at the trial were not hers. She had protected him, kept his secrets, just as his family had done his entire life. The prosecutor's case had made sense to Lynn. She knew Robert's ways. She knew he trolled the Bay Shore towns along Route 36 in Monmouth County, looking for girls. That was how she met him. It was January 1965. Lynn was a teenager living in Cliffwood Beach, near Atlantic Highlands, where Rosemary Calandrella lived. Lynn had gone to the candy store and was walking toward a friend's house when the white Ford convertible pulled up alongside her. Robert rolled down his window. "It's cold outside," he said. "Do you want a ride?" Lynn said, "No, thank you," but Robert pulled over and they talked a while. "I'd like to see you," he said. "I'll be babysitting later," Lynn said. "Maybe I could stop over?" he asked. Lynn made sure she had friends there when Robert arrived a little while later. One was a rookie police officer. The evening was fun, with everyone talking and laughing. She began dating Robert after that. Lynn had often thought about what might have happened if she'd gotten into his car that first night. "I was the one that got away," she thought. Lynn awoke in a hospital room, with a doctor standing over her. She had been in a coma for days and had not been expected to live. "Young lady, do you know what you did?" the doctor said. "Yes, I do," Lynn said, "and I will never do it again." That day, Lynn made a promise to herself. She would break away from the Zerinskys, no matter what it took or how long. Lynn started working long hours at the pharmaceutical company. She opened a savings account and didn't tell anyone. For once, she had secrets of her own. One promotion led to another, and before long she was a department supervisor and earning enough to support herself. The more independent she became, the more Robert and his mother struggled to control her. Robert's first bid for parole was rejected several months after Lynn's suicide attempt, but he was a constant presence in her life, calling her ever more frequently. His threats became increasingly scary. She thought about reporting him, but was too afraid. Sometimes, during their prison visits, when the guards turned their backs, he would place his arm around Lynn's neck, as if he was hugging her, and squeeze until she could hardly breathe. If she ever left him, he promised, he would ruin her reputation and get her fired from the job. No one would ever hire her again. Then what would she do? Once, he whispered he would get a shiv and stab her if she even mentioned divorce. Lynn began skipping the weekend visits to Robert. Sometimes she refused to answer the telephone. Veronica, who was suffering from emphysema, would climb the stairs and, gasping for breath, beg her to talk to him. Robert told Lynn he was having her watched. He knew her every move. On Tuesday, April 28, 1992, you left Newark International Airport at 4:15 p.m. aboard Flight 939 and stayed in room 170 at the Pheasant Run Resort in St. Charles, Illinois, he wrote in a letter. She was so alarmed she began keeping his letters and taping his telephone calls. Without proof, no one would believe the things Robert said and did. In 1994, Linda attended a training course for work. A motivational speaker gave the keynote address. "If your life is going to change," the speaker said, "you have to change it." Lynn hung on every word. She thought about her life. She was tired of Robert's cruelty. When Robert called her at home that night, Lynn cut him off. She was too tired to talk. "Call me in the morning," she said. "You are not going to like it when I come out of here," Robert said. "You keep talking to me like that, and I swear to God you are going to regret it." Lynn mustered up all of her courage. "If you think I'm going to stay married to a time bomb like you, you're out of your mind," she said. 18 years of my life you've taken from me. I want to be free before I die." Robert exploded. "You're going to get it," he said. "You are asking for it. You don't know me. I will do what I say. When I get my hands on your neck, I will twist it like a grape." A moment later, Zerinsky got hold of himself and tried a different tactic. He blamed Lynn for making him threaten her. "See what you did to me?" he pleaded. Lynn hung up the phone, cleared out her closet, and walked out of the Zerinsky house forever. Within days, she filed for divorce. A week or so later, Robert tracked her down to a high-rise in Linden and called. "My mother will die if you don't go back," he said. She could not imagine how he knew where she was. Her telephone number was unpublished, and she had not told anyone where she was going. "I'm sorry, but I'm not going back," she said, hanging up the phone. Robert's letters arrived almost daily after that. "The fact that you changed your phone number again presents no problem," he wrote in one. "I will be able to develop your new phone number and any new phone numbers after that, using a special grid of numerical crisscrossing and cross-referencing which took me over 2 months to develop. It is foolproof. A very tedious procedure of elimination using the 4-code spectrum grid I developed, which covers all possible number variations." In another letter, he wrote, "No matter how I express my love for you, it seems you don't care. Even my mother, as old and weak as she is, told me an entire week can go by and you don't even call her on the phone. All my mother remembers is that the two of you had such a quiet and wonderful life together until this divorce caused everything to go to hell." Less than a year later, in January of 1995, Lynn received a telephone call from Robert's sister, Judith. "Veronica Zirinsky was in the hospital," she said. Time was short. Lynn went to sit by her bedside. As she listened to Veronica's labored breathing, she found herself wondering why this woman she had come to know so well, and yes, if she was honest with herself, even to love, had spent her life covering up the terrible things her son had done. But then they had that in common. Lynn had a hard time living with the lies. They often kept her awake at night. What did Veronica have on her conscience? Did she even have a conscience? Death was closing in on Veronica Zirinsky. Delirious and struggling for every breath, she looked into Lynn's eyes as if she wanted to say something. "What is it?" Lynn asked. "My Bob," Veronica Zirinsky whispered. "My Bob." Veronica's dying wish to see her son one last time was granted a day later, but by then it was too late. She had slipped into unconsciousness. Robert was escorted by armed prison guards to Veronica's bedside. He sat beside her, held her hand and kissed her face, then whispered in her ear that he loved her. A few hours later, Veronica died, taking decades of family secrets to her grave. But with her death, some of those secrets would begin to emerge, including one about the unsolved killing more than 4 decades earlier of a Rahway police officer named Charles Bernowski. Chapter 11. The Husband's Grip. An excerpt from the Psychological Evaluation for Parole for Robert Zirinsky, inmate number 56449, in prison since 1975. Clinical interview completed April 16, 1989. Psychological testing completed March 9, 1989. Mr. Zirinsky is a married white male currently serving a life sentence for murder. Institutional records indicate a model inmate with no institutional charges since incarceration. Mr. Zirinsky presented as neatly groomed, polite, and well-oriented. Stated mood was, quote, "I'm all right emotionally," unquote. Affect was flat, and Mr. Zirinsky remained expressionless until he smiled at the end of the interview, asking, quote, "Is this the oddest case you've ever worked with?" unquote. Clinical impression is of a schizoid, emotionally detached individual with a continued potential for decompensation and erratic behavior. He does appear to experience sincere guilt for his behavior. He has no awareness of the powerful rage he harbors within, and presents as a rigid, overly controlled, robotic individual who massively represses his emotional life. Lynn Zirinsky crept up the stairs and through the front door. It was almost midnight. She should have been home hours ago. Her husband's attorney had invited her to his office Christmas party, and she lost track of time. She hoped her mother-in-law did not hear her key in the lock. In the decade and a half since Robert Zirinsky was found guilty of murdering Rosemary Calandrello, Lynn had been a loyal wife. Her 20s and half of her 30s had passed by in a whirlwind of prison visits, legwork for legal appeals, and whatever else it took to satisfy her demanding husband. Zirinsky was in state prison, but he would be eligible for parole in a matter of months. Even if he was denied, he would be entitled to go before the parole board periodically for review. Eventually, he promised, he would be home. Zirinsky's control over his family was as strong as ever. He could no longer intimidate Lynn with his clenched fists, but his emotional grip had tightened to the point where she feared him even more than before his conviction. For the first years after Zorinsky went away in 1975, Lynn rarely left the house she shared with her in-laws in Linden. She depended on Robert's mother, Veronica, to drive, to cook, and to keep her company. But after her father-in-law Julius died in 1978, and the family's wholesale produce business went under, Lynn got permission from Zorinsky to get a driver's license and a job so she could help his mother with the bills. He needed a place to come home to, he said. When Lynn started work at a local electronics company, Robert ordered Veronica to keep a close eye on her. His mother was happy to oblige. Robert called Lynn before she left for work in the morning, and he called within minutes of her return home. Then he called all evening, every time he could get to the phone, until the prisons shut off the phones at 9 p.m. If Lynn did not answer by the second or third ring, Robert called downstairs to his mother to find out why. Lynn ran away once. It was 1983 and she was working at a pharmaceutical company. She left for work one morning and moved into a trailer home in another town. Within 2 weeks, Robert had her telephone number and address. My friend from the law library was paroled on a second-degree murder conviction, Zorinsky wrote to Lynn, and he was living with some woman in the Carteret Mobile Park. I got his phone number and told him that you were living in J16. For 2 cartons of cigarettes, he said, he could hire 2 ex-cons to bash in her head with a baseball bat. Lynn could not live like that. She moved back with her mother-in-law and settled quickly into her old routines. Trying not to make any noise as she headed up the stairs to her bedroom, Lynn heard movement in the kitchen. Her mother-in-law had waited up. "Lynn," she yelled, "is that you?" Lynn backtracked down the stairs and walked into the kitchen. Veronica Zorinsky looked crazed. Bob had called 5 or 6 times, she said. He was frantic because he could not reach her. "I'm sorry," Lynn said, trying to appease her. "The time got away from me. I didn't realize—" "You're the reason my Bob's in prison," Veronica screamed. "Everything went wrong after you came into our life." Lynn took a step back. "Damn you!" Veronica cried, punching Lynn with the same fury that Robert once had. Lynn stared into her mother-in-law's cold blue eyes and saw Robert. "That was for Bob," Veronica said, then turned and left the room. That night, Lynn Zorinsky said a prayer. "Dear God, forgive me. I'm tired. I cannot do this anymore." She gathered a handful of antidepressants and sleeping pills the doctor had prescribed years earlier after little Bobby died. The pills went down with 1 swallow. Lynn lay down on her bed and thought about her life. Except for the 2 years she had with her son before he died of complications from asthma, it had hardly been worth living. She had done a lot of thinking after Robert was arrested. He had stalked young girls and killed the Calandrello girl, just as the police said. She was sure of it. No one knew better than Lynn what a monster Robert could be. As she began to lose consciousness, Lynn admitted to herself what she had never admitted to anyone. She had perjured herself on the witness stand in the Calandrello trial. She had felt she had no choice. Robert had not been home the night Rosemary Calandrello disappeared, as she had testified he was. Lynn remembered him picking a fight with her, or maybe with his father, and storming out of the house. The underwear found in the back seat of the convertible had probably belonged to the girl. Despite Robert's prompting and her subsequent testimony, Lynn did not recall ever changing her clothes in the car, and the bikini underpants presented as evidence at the trial were not hers. She had protected him, kept his secrets, just as his family had done his entire life. The prosecutor's case had made sense to Lynn. She knew Robert's ways. She knew he trolled the Bay Shore towns along Route 36 in Monmouth County, looking for girls. That was how she met him. It was January 1965. Lynn was a teenager living in Cliffwood Beach, near Atlantic Highlands, where Rosemary Calandrello lived. Lynn had gone to the candy store and was walking toward a friend's house when the white Ford convertible pulled up alongside her. Robert rolled down his window. "It's cold outside," he said. "Do you want a ride?" Lynn said, "No, thank you," but Robert pulled over and they talked a while. "I'd like to see you," he said. "I'll be babysitting later," Lynn said. "Maybe I could stop over?" he asked. Lynn made sure she had friends there when Robert arrived a little while later. One was a rookie police officer. The evening was fun, with everyone talking and laughing. She began dating Robert after that. Lynn had often thought about what might have happened if she'd gotten into his car that first night. I was the one that got away, she thought. Lynn awoke in a hospital room, with the doctor standing over her. She had been in a coma for days and had not been expected to live. "Young lady, do you know what you did?" the doctor said. "Yes, I do," Lynn said, "and I will never do it again." That day, Lynn made a promise to herself. She would break away from the Zerinskys, no matter what it took or how long. Lynn started working long hours at the pharmaceutical company. She opened a savings account and didn't tell anyone. For once, she had secrets of her own. One promotion led to another, and before long she was a department supervisor and earning enough to support herself. The more independent she became, the more Robert and his mother struggled to control her. Robert's first bid for parole was rejected several months after Lynn's suicide attempt, but he was a constant presence in her life, calling her ever more frequently. His threats became increasingly scary. She thought about reporting him, but was too afraid. Sometimes, during their prison visits, when the guards turned their backs, he would place his arm around Lynn's neck, as if he was hugging her, and squeeze until she could hardly breathe. If she ever left him, he promised, he would ruin her reputation and get her fired from the job. No one would ever hire her again. Then what would she do? Once, he whispered he would get a shiv and stab her if she even mentioned divorce. Lynn began skipping the weekend visits to Robert. Sometimes she refused to answer the telephone. Veronica, who was suffering from emphysema, would climb the stairs and, gasping for breath, beg her to talk to him. Robert told Lynn he was having her watched. He knew her every move. On Tuesday, April 28, 1992, you left Newark International Airport at 4:15 p.m. aboard Flight 939 and stayed in room 170 at the Pheasant Run Resort in St. Charles, Illinois, he wrote in a letter. She was so alarmed she began keeping his letters and taping his telephone calls. Without proof, no one would believe the things Robert said and did. In 1994, Linda attended a training course for work. A motivational speaker gave the keynote address. "If your life is going to change," the speaker said, "you have to change it." Lynn hung on every word. She thought about her life. She was tired of Robert's cruelty. When Robert called her at home that night, Lynn cut him off. She was too tired to talk. "Call me in the morning," she said. "You are not going to like it when I come out of here," Robert said. "You keep talking to me like that, and I swear to God you are going to regret it." Lynn mustered up all of her courage. "If you think I'm going to stay married to a time bomb like you, you're out of your mind," she said. 18 years of my life you have taken from me. I want to be free before I die." Robert exploded. "You're going to get it," he said. "You are asking for it. You don't know me. I will do what I say. When I get my hands on your neck, I will twist it like a grape." A moment later, Zerinsky got hold of himself and tried a different tactic. He blamed Lynn for making him threaten her. "See what you did to me?" he pleaded. Lynn hung up the phone, cleared out her closet, and walked out of the Zerinsky house forever. Within days, she filed for divorce. A week or so later, Robert tracked her down to a high-rise in Linden and called. "My mother will die if you don't go back," he said. She could not imagine how he knew where she was. Her telephone number was unpublished, and she had not told anyone where she was going. "I'm sorry, but I'm not going back," she said, hanging up the phone. Robert's letters arrived almost daily after that. "The fact that you changed your phone number again presents no problem," he wrote in one. "I will be able to develop your new phone number and any new phone numbers after that, using a special grid of numerical crisscrossing and cross-referencing which took me over 2 months to develop. It is foolproof. A very tedious procedure of elimination using the 4-code spectrum grid I developed, which covers all possible number variations." In another letter, he wrote, "No matter how I express my love for you, it seems you don't care. Even my mother, as old and weak as she is, told me an entire week can go by and you don't even call her on the phone. All my mother remembers is that the two of you had such a quiet and wonderful life together until this divorce caused everything to go to hell." Less than a year later, in January of 1995, Lynn received a telephone call from Robert's sister, Judith. Veronica Zirinsky was in the hospital, she said. Time was short. Lynn went to sit by her bedside. As she listened to Veronica's labored breathing, she found herself wondering why this woman she had come to know so well, and yes, if she was honest with herself, even to love, had spent her life covering up the terrible things her son had done. But then they had that in common. Lynn had a hard time living with the lies. They often kept her awake at night. What did Veronica have on her conscience? Did she even have a conscience? Death was closing in on Veronica Zirinsky. Delirious and struggling for every breath, she looked into Lynn's eyes as if she wanted to say something. "What is it?" Lynn asked. "My Bob," Veronica Zirinsky whispered. "My Bob." Veronica's dying wish to see her son one last time was granted a day later, but by then it was too late. She had slipped into unconsciousness. Robert was escorted by armed prison guards to Veronica's bedside. He sat beside her, held her hand and kissed her face, then whispered in her ear that he loved her. A few hours later, Veronica died, taking decades of family secrets to her grave. But with her death, some of those secrets would begin to emerge, including one about the unsolved killing more than 4 decades earlier of a Rahway police officer named Charles Bernowski.
Welcome back to Deadly Secrets, the untold story of a killer named Robert Zirinsky. Deadly Secrets is the product of more than a year of reporting by Robin Gaby Fisher and Judith Lucas of the Star-Ledger of Newark, New Jersey. It is narrated by Wallace Stroby.
Chapter 12. Back to the Past. The woman sobbed as Detective Bill White tried to console her. "I'm sorry," she said, clutching a handful of tissues. "I'm so sorry." After scribbling the date on his notepad, July 7th, 1999, White looked into Judith Zirinsky Sapsa's frightened eyes. Why was she apologizing, the Rahway police officer wondered, and what secret was she about to share? "It happened the day after Thanksgiving 1958, she began. "I was about 15 years old," she said, "and I was sitting in the living room of my house at 402 Bower Street. I think the time was 10:30 or 11 p.m. I had just made some French fries, and I was watching the TV. White was amazed by the woman's recall. He couldn't remember what he had eaten for breakfast, but she knew she had made French fries on a night more than 4 decades ago. Sapsa went on. "The front door opened, and my Aunt Irene Chagas, my brother Robert Zirinsky, and my cousin Teddy Schiffer came into the house," she said. "They went into the kitchen, and my aunt told my mother that my cousin and my brother came to her house for help, but she couldn't help them, so she brought them to my house. My brother said that he and my cousin were trying to rob Miller Pontiac, and the police came. The boys started to run, and there was shooting," Sapsa said. "My brother said he got pissed off because the cop shot my cousin, so he, my brother, shot the cop." Right there in the kitchen, her mother Veronica performed surgery on the wounded boy, Sapsa said. "She was in my cousin's chest using tweezers and gauze and peroxide. Then she took a bullet out of my brother's hip." Her mother swore everyone to secrecy that night, Sapsa said. The next morning, her father, Julius, picked up the newspaper at the curb. The headline on the paper said that a policeman was dead, she said. Charles Bernowski, who had been on the Rahway police force less than 4 years, had been shot to death, leaving behind a pregnant wife and 5 children. Julius Zirinsky went into the bathroom and vomited, and no one ever spoke of it again. The Zirinsky family had been under the hypnotic domination of Robert and had spent a lifetime keeping his secrets to protect him, Sapsa told White. She said her brother had abused her, physically and sexually, for years when she was a young girl. Once, she recounted, he beat her so badly she missed school for 2 weeks. Their mother had told Robert, "Don't hit her in the face," so that no one would see what he had done. Sapsa had been as guilty of hiding her brother's sins as her parents had been, she said. Not only had she kept quiet all those years about the Bernowski murder, but she suspected her brother had killed many young girls. White tried to keep his composure as he listened. Sapsa's story sounded like something out of a murder mystery, but he found himself believing her. He had spent 20 years on the railway police force, where Officer Charles Bernowski was a legend. His picture hung in headquarters, and a monument with his name on it had been erected outside. Bernowski's widow, Betty, still called occasionally to ask about his unsolved slaying. Every year, someone in the department would take a fresh look at the case, but there wasn't much to go on. Just a single fingerprint lifted from the car dealership where Bernowski had interrupted a robbery, and it had never matched any on file. Everyone knew Zorinsky had murdered Rosemary Calandrello. He had served 24 years of a life sentence, and he was suspected of killing other young girls. Now, 41 years after the fact, it appeared the police were about to link the notorious killer to the killing of Officer Bernowski as well. Zorinsky had been denied parole so far, but there was always a chance the parole board would relent. A conviction in the Bernowski case would ensure that Zorinsky never went free. "Judy, why are you telling me about this incident at this time?" White asked. "It's the right thing to do," she said. "I should have told this a long time ago. My main purpose is that I don't want my brother to get out of prison, because he will murder us all." Judith Sapsa had come to the detective because she was in trouble. When Veronica Zorinsky died in January 1995, she left almost everything she had to her son. Robert got the family house in Linden, some land, and a $121,000 mutual fund account. Judith inherited $30,000 in telecommunication stocks. Veronica had always found ways to hurt Judith, but that final slight had been the most painful. Still, facing the possibility of Robert receiving parole, Judith agreed to keep up the house for him. She was too frightened of her brother to refuse. Her daughter, Kimberly, collected the annual mutual fund statements and sent them to Uncle Robert in state prison. Zorinsky was determined to keep his boyhood home. He liked the idea of having money, and he paid meticulous attention to his financial statements. Between the house and the mutual fund account, he was worth at least $250,000. He could have a nice life when he finally got out, and he was determined that he would. The parole board had rejected his bid for release twice already, citing his lack of remorse and his steadfast refusal to reveal where Rosemary Calandrello's remains could be found. If the board rejected his bid for parole a third time, he would keep filing legal appeals until a judge decided he had been punished enough. Then, in late 1998, the annual financial statement didn't arrive. Zorinsky asked his sister, "Where is it?" "It got lost," Judith said. When the statement didn't come by the end of March 1999, Zorinsky contacted the mutual fund group and learned his account had been nearly emptied. Between April 1998 and April 1999, it turned out, 21 checks totaling $112,500 were cashed by a man claiming to be Robert Zorinsky. A bank teller was able to identify the man from a photograph. It was Peter Sapsa, Judith's husband. Judith Sapsa confessed everything to Postal Inspector Joseph Jakubik. Her husband had become critically ill in January of 1997 with congestive heart failure, she told him. He was forced to give up his job at a supermarket and was put on a heart transplant list. She had her own health problems. Overwhelmed by medical bills, the Sapsas fell behind on their mortgage and property taxes. The furnace stopped working, and the car was falling apart. Sapsa contacted Robert in prison and asked for a loan. She was still terrified of him, but she was desperate for help. Zorinsky turned her away. He needed his money for when he got out of prison, he said. "So then I took it," Sapsa told Jakubik. When the theft was discovered, Sapsa wrote a letter to her brother. "Please forgive me," she begged. She offered to sell her house to repay him, but the offer wasn't good enough. "My sister and her husband are thieves and liars," Zorinsky wrote the postal inspector, demanding they receive the harshest punishment under the law. On June 23, 1999, Peter Sapsa was arrested and charged with taking Zorinsky's money. Judith, who was 56, expected to be charged too. She was the one who had hatched the plan. Her husband was only following her orders, and everyone who knew them knew Peter always did what Judith told him to do. 2 weeks later, Judith's lawyer contacted the Union County prosecutor to say his client needed to unburden herself. She wasn't asking for anything in return. She had a story to tell, though, about a 41-year-old unsolved murder case. Detective White listened to Judith's story with Frank Pfeiffer, the lead investigator for the Union County Prosecutor's Office. She talked for more than an hour. It seemed the more she talked, the more composed she became, and her story made sense. White knew a case against Zorinsky could be tricky, though. A good defense attorney would exploit the mutual fund embezzlement and argue that Sapsa was lying about the cop killing to get a break for herself and her husband. And what about Teddy Schiffer, the cousin Judith said was present at the 1958 murder, who was shot in the gun battle between Officer Bernowski and her brother? How old would Teddy Schiffer be today? White asked Judith. About 61 years old, she answered. To the best of your knowledge, is Teddy Schiffer alive? Yes, she said. Where does he live? Carbondale, Pennsylvania. Carbondale was a former coal mining town, about 15 miles northeast of Scranton. It had seen better days. The main hangout was the L&M Tavern, and it was smoky from morning until closing time. Ted Schiffer had lived most of his life in and around Carbondale. Divorced with grown children, he worked in shoe factories and construction. He had moved to Florida for a spell, but returned to install carpets in the Scranton area. The local cops knew his name, but only from an occasional scrape at the L&M. Schiffer's address was the Senior Citizens Housing Project next to the old Erie-Lackawanna Railroad tracks. Detectives White and Pfeiffer arrived at the four-story brick building before the sun came up on August 12, 1999. From a photograph, they recognized the man walking from the apartment building to his car, and they approached him. Are you Theodore Schiffer? White asked. I am. We'd like to ask you a few questions. White asked Schiffer to follow them to the local precinct. Schiffer agreed. When they sat down to talk, White asked, Do you remember a cop killing in Rahway back in 1958? You're going back a long way, Schiffer said. White felt almost sorry for Schiffer. He looked old and vulnerable, not like someone involved in a cold-blooded killing. Judith Sapsa had said Schiffer was a good guy who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. White told Schiffer about meeting with Judith. She's my cousin, Schiffer said. She's a nice girl. What about the Rahway cop shooting? White asked. Had he been there with his cousin, Robert Zorinsky? She must be mistaken, Schiffer said. White and Pfeiffer had obtained a court order to fingerprint Schiffer. Pennsylvania trooper Joseph Coco took his prints while White and Pfeiffer talked to him. White asked Schiffer to take off his shirt. Schiffer obliged, but twisted his body, trying to hide the scar on the left side of his chest, the spot where Judith had said he had been shot that night in 1958. Where'd you get the scar? White asked Schiffer. I fell on some barbed wire, he said. A while later, Trooper Coco motioned that he had the results of his fingerprint analysis, comparing Schiffer's prints to the one found at the crime scene 4 decades earlier. That's your guy, Coco mouthed to Pfeiffer, while White continued talking to Schiffer. In the small interview room, White felt his knees tremble. He thought about Officer Bernowski's picture on the wall back at police headquarters in Rahway, the one he had looked at almost every day for 20 years. You're under arrest, he told Schiffer, cuffing his hands behind his back. Legally, the interview was over. I can't talk to you, White said, but you can call me if you want to tell me what happened. You already know, Schiffer replied. Chapter 13. On the Witness Stand. Ted Schiffer shuffled from the back of the courtroom to the witness stand. He looked tired and scared. More than 40 years of keeping a terrible secret, of waiting to be found out, had taken its toll. Deep creases lined his cheeks, and gray pouches sagged under his eyes. The only thing that frightened Schiffer more than prison was his cousin, Robert Zorinsky, and now he was facing both. Zorinsky sat just a few short strides away, clad in a blue shirt and khakis, staring at him without blinking. Schiffer stole a glance at Zorinsky, then quickly averted his eyes. The State versus Robert Zirinsky in the matter of the murder of Rahway police officer Charles Bernowski began on May 16, 2001. Curiosity seekers and Rahway cops jostled with reporters for seats in the old-fashioned courtroom in Elizabeth. Retired Atlantic Highlands Police Chief Sam Guzzi, who as a detective was responsible for Zirinsky's 1975 conviction for murdering a teenager named Rosemary Calandrello, watched from the back row. Union County Assistant Prosecutor William Colano placed himself between Schiffer and Zirinsky and began his questioning. On November 28, 1958, did you leave your home in Pennsylvania to come to New Jersey? I did, Schiffer said. Where did you meet up with your cousin, Robert Zirinsky? At his home, Schiffer said, wiping his brow. Whose idea was it to rob Miller Pontiac? It had been Robert's idea, Schiffer said. He said it would be easy. We would be in and out. Zirinsky showed him a gun, Schiffer said. We'll use this in case I need it for a backup, he recalled his cousin saying. Schiffer drove to the car dealership. He didn't want to go, he said, but he changed his mind after Robert called him a chicken. Robert was a scary guy. You didn't go against him if you knew what was good for you. When they got to the dealership, Schiffer said, Robert pried open the bay door. I was a nervous wreck, Schiffer said. Inside, Robert went to the office. Schiffer heard a rattling of the door at the front of the building. He yelled to Robert, who was trying to open the office safe. Schiffer and Zirinsky ran out the same way we came in, he said. Robert was right behind me. I crouched by a shed, Schiffer said. A police officer came up from behind. Rahway police officer Charles Bernowski. He nudged me in the butt with his foot and told me I could get up. I froze. Then Robert hollered out, Run! I got up and took off running. Next, I heard gunfire. Schiffer said he turned around and saw Robert and the police officer shooting at each other. He felt a bullet pierce his chest, but he kept running, and Robert caught up. I told him I was shot, Schiffer said. He says, I'm shot too. The pair got in Schiffer's car and drove through a heavy rain to a nearby river or reservoir. Schiffer wasn't sure, and Robert tossed the gun into the water. Had you ever been arrested in your life other than relating to this incident? Colano asked. No, sir, Schiffer said. Betty Bernowski sat in the front row of Judge Walter Barasonic's courtroom, huddled with some of her 6 children. She had been 28 years old and pregnant when her husband was gunned down. In the 4 decades since, she had put herself through nursing school, raised their children, and watched them all go to college, marry, and raise their own families. At 70, Betty Bernowski had 16 grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild. Over the years she had been proposed to, but she never remarried, and she still lived in Rahway in the house she and Charles bought as newlyweds in 1949. She had waited a long time for her husband's murder to be solved. As the witness spoke, some of the jurors were clearly moved. One woman's bottom lip quivered as Schiffer told about how guilty he felt for keeping the secret of Officer Bernowski's murder for all those years. Schiffer said he had spent a lifetime looking over his shoulder, waiting for someone to say, I know what you did. The thought of confessing had crossed his mind many times, he testified, but he had never told Carol, his wife of 35 years, or his 2 children about the shooting. Betty Bernowski felt no sympathy. If you asked her, Schiffer had plenty of chances to come forward and make things right. Plenty of chances to spare her and her children all those years of anguish. The case against Robert Zirinsky was not without its difficulties for the prosecution. The state's star witnesses had baggage. Schiffer had cut a deal with the prosecutor to plead guilty to felony murder and serve 15 years in a state prison near his family in Pennsylvania in exchange for his testimony against Zirinsky. With good behavior, he would be out in 3 years, a fact pointed out to the jury by Zirinsky's lawyer, Joseph Benedict. Zirinsky's sister, Judith Sapsa, had broken the family's long silence about the Bernowski murder only after she and her husband were caught stealing from her brother's trust fund. Like Schiffer, Sapsa was clearly terrified of Zirinsky. Sapsa had provided investigators with disturbing details about her brother. He was a bedwetter who sexually abused and beat her, she said, and he used to catch birds and pull off their heads. Overweight and in ill health, she looked much older than her 58 years as she hobbled with a cane to the witness stand. "When was the last time you saw your brother in person?" Colano asked. "In January of 1995, Judith said. Their mother was dying, and Robert was brought from prison to visit her in the hospital." Colano asked her to tell the jury something about the family dynamic. "It was a very secretive family," Sapsa said. "My mother believed in keeping everything inside the family. She was very close to my brother." Avoiding her brother's eyes, Sapsa told her story. She was 15 on the night in question, November 28, 1958. She was watching TV when her brother and her cousin barged into the house. Both had been shot and were bleeding. Her brother said they had been caught robbing Miller Pontiac. Benedict cut to the heart of the defense during his cross-examination. "Let me ask you, point blank," he said, "did you concoct this story to get even with your brother for some reason?" "How could I concoct something like this?" Sapsa shot back. Joseph Benedict was known as one of the best defense attorneys in the state. He was smart and commanding, important qualities for someone whose clients were frequently unsympathetic characters accused of atrocious crimes. Benedict thought Robert Zirinsky was more obnoxious and egomaniacal than most. In the 26 years Zirinsky had served for murdering 17-year-old Rosemary Calandrello, he had become proficient in the law. He had spent his time in prison preparing endless appeals to try to gain early release, and had come to fancy himself a skilled jailhouse lawyer. Benedict learned to be on his toes when dealing with Zirinsky. The man had a photographic memory. He could recite law books chapter and verse, and he was not shy about questioning Benedict's judgment. Despite Benedict's counsel that he say nothing, Zirinsky insisted on testifying. The last time an attorney had advised him not to take the stand, in the Rosemary Calandrello trial in 1975, he had agreed and was convicted of murder. He did not want to take that chance this time, he said. He would make the jury believe him. The courtroom was packed when Zirinsky took the stand. He appeared relaxed and eager to answer his lawyer's questions. He said he could not remember exactly what he did on that Friday after Thanksgiving in 1958 when Officer Bernowski was killed. He'd probably gone to the movies with his girlfriend, he said. That's what he did most Friday nights. "Some things I remember clearly," Zirinsky testified, "like my graduation, going to the senior prom." He was certain he was nowhere near the car dealership that day, but no one who could verify his whereabouts that night was still alive, except his sister, he said, and his sister was lying. Zirinsky said the scar on his hip, the one the prosecutor suggested came from Bernowski's bullet, was the result of a stab wound he suffered in a fight with a girlfriend 5 months before the Bernowski killing. Pulling up his shirt, Zirinsky pointed to the scar, and jury members leaned in to take a look. He suggested his cousin had killed Bernowski and, with his sister, framed him for the murder. In 1958, Schiffer had a friend who had just been released from prison for manslaughter, Zirinsky said. That was Schiffer's burglary partner, he said. They were robbing garages and dealerships back then. When it was Colano's turn to question Zirinsky, the prosecutor jumped out of his seat. "You had a good relationship with Judy growing up, didn't you?" Colano asked. "Yes." "To this day, to your knowledge, did you ever give Judy Sapsa, your sister, a reason to want to falsely accuse you?" "Her stealing my money was the reason," Zirinsky said. "Did you tell your sister you shot the cop because the cop shot Teddy?" Colano asked. "I never told my sister that," Zirinsky answered calmly. "You remember telling Ted Schiffer you shot the cop?" "I never told Schiffer that either." "You don't remember killing the police officer?" "I did not kill the police officer. Definitely, I did not kill him." Closing arguments were passionately delivered. "The state's key witnesses are trying to frame Zirinsky to get breaks in their own criminal cases," Benedict said. Sapsa made up her story, and Schiffer repeated what the prosecution wanted him to say. "The only person lying is the defendant," countered the prosecutor. Zirinsky had fired 3 times at Officer Charles Bernowski, striking him twice in the chest and once in the face. "If that's not intention to kill, what is?" Colano asked. The jury of 7 women and 5 men deliberated for 9 hours over 2 days. On Friday, May 25th, They sent word to the judge. We're ready. Betty Bernowski locked arms with 3 of her children as the jury filed in slowly. She had waited 43 years for an answer in the investigation of her husband's death, and she was ready to see justice done. The jury foreman rose to his feet. "Not guilty," he said. Bernowski stared in disbelief. Some of the jurors wept as the verdict was read. In interviews afterwards, some said that they had wanted in the worst way to convict Zirinsky of murdering the police officer, but both of the state's key witnesses had credibility problems and reasons to lie. What if Judith had made up her story to curry favor with the prosecutor in her own case? And what if Schiffer had implicated Zirinsky as the shooter to protect himself? "My gut is Mr. Robert Zirinsky is guilty," Foreman Thomas O'Brien explained. "We said, man, we want to put this guy in jail, but the evidence did not show that beyond a reasonable doubt." Sam Guzzi, who had never given up on trying to connect Zirinsky to other killings, shook his head when the verdict was read. He knew Zirinsky was headed back to a maximum security cell to continue serving his sentence for the murder of Rosemary Calandrello, but for how long? A conviction in the Bernowski case, on top of the Calandrello murder, would have made sure Zirinsky spent the rest of his life behind bars. With his acquittal, it was much more likely he would go free someday, unless another of his secrets somehow came to light. What Guzzi didn't know, what no one that day could have known, was that one of those secrets, long hidden in a mental evidence locker in Monmouth County, was about to reveal the truth about another decades-old killing. The killing of 13-year-old Jane Duryea. Chapter 14. Proof Positive. The man on the telephone introduced himself as a detective from New Jersey. "What can I do for you?" asked Robert Shaler, director of the Forensic Biology Lab for the New York City Medical Examiner's Office. "I'm hoping you can help us with an unsolved murder," said Paul Seitz of the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office. It was July 2004. Shaler had been in charge of identifying the remains of 9/11 victims at the World Trade Center. The task was grim and wearisome, and he was preparing to leave soon for a less demanding job. A murder in New Jersey was not something he wished to hear about. But Shaler, often compared to Santa Claus because of his white beard, ruddy cheeks, and twinkling blue eyes, was too polite not to listen to what the detective had to say. And Seitz sounded desperate. "Go on," Shaler said. In March of 1968, 2 young orphan sisters from Harlem moved to homes a mile apart at the Jersey Shore, Seitz explained. 9 months later, one of the girls, Jane Duryea, was raped and bludgeoned to death while walking home from her sister's house. She was 13. The case had remained unsolved for 35 years, but advances in DNA testing, Seitz explained, had recently produced a suspect, a man already in prison for sexual assault. The prosecutor brought charges against the man based on the DNA finding. However, it was far from a precise match, and worse, the sample might have been contaminated during testing. The prosecutor's case was now at risk. Would Shaler help them develop solid DNA proof? Jane's story tugged at Shaler's heart. "I'll do whatever I can to help," he said. 3 years earlier, in May 2001, Robert Zirinsky had stood trial for the 1958 murder of a Rahway police officer. During the trial, newspaper stories recounted his past, how he was already serving a life sentence for the 1969 murder of an Atlantic Highlands teenager, and how he was a suspect in several unsolved cases involving teenage girls around the same time. Jane Duryea's murder was similar to the ones for which Zirinsky was a suspect, and she had been killed within a few miles of Atlantic Highlands, the newspaper stories pointed out. Joan Conway was paying attention. Joan Conway had been Joan Duryea, one of Jane Duryea's sisters and her inseparable friend. She was 14 when she waved goodbye to Jane for the last time. At 49, Jane still cried every time she looked at a picture that showed Jane and her together in their Easter dresses. She still felt guilty for being the one who survived. When Jane was murdered, Joan had wanted to die too. Time brought little healing. Joan lived behind closed blinds for fear that Jane's killer was lurking somewhere, and she always held her keys in her hand in case she had to get away. Over the years, whenever stories about Robert Zirinsky ran in the local papers, Joan wondered if he could have been Jane's killer. Then, when she read that Zirinsky was acquitted of murdering the police officer, she decided to ask. Joan called the Middletown Police Department and said she wanted to talk to someone about the possibility that Zirinsky had killed her sister. A detective invited her to headquarters to discuss Jane's case. When she got there, Detective Paul Seitz, who investigated cold cases for the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office, was waiting. Seitz, a bear of a man with piercing blue eyes, told Joan he had been reviewing cold cases in which Zirinsky was a suspect, and Jane's case was among them. The detective said his instinct told him Zirinsky killed Jane, but it would take a lot of legwork to prove it. Over the next 3 years, Seitz kept in touch with Joan, encouraging her to believe the case eventually would be solved. She, in turn, had faith that when the breakthrough came, it would point to Zirinsky. So when the prosecutor's office called to say it had a suspect, Joan was stunned. It was someone she had never heard of. At a press conference on June 16, 2004, Monmouth County Prosecutor John Kay declared, "Through DNA, we put a face to the killer of Jane Duryea, and that face belongs to Jerry Bellamy." Next to him stood Joan Conway. "We only had each other, and he took her away," she told the reporters. DNA was the only evidence linking Bellamy to Jane's murder, Kay explained, but DNA has been sufficient to release people from prison, he said. It should also be sufficient to put them in. The prosecutor's performance was impressive, and the news played big in newspapers and on television. Bellamy, 53, had been serving time in a maximum security prison for habitual sex offenders. He was in jail for forcing an 18-year-old woman to have sex with him in an Atlantic City motel. He had previously served time in a case involving the rape of a 15-year-old girl. The evidence used to charge Bellamy for the murder of Jane Duryea came from a police evidence locker that held Jane's clothes, including her underwear and slip. The State Police Crime Lab had tested semen stains found on the underwear and came up with a, quote, weak and partial, unquote, DNA profile similar to the one on file for Bellamy. Although it was not strong enough to prove Bellamy killed Jane, it strongly suggests investigating the individual cited, wrote Harvey Corey, manager of the State Police DNA Index System, in a confidential memorandum. Bellamy was about to be released from prison when Kay decided to charge him with murder. But just as the prosecutor was preparing to go to the grand jury, the forensic scientist who linked Bellamy's DNA to Jane's underwear told his supervisor he may have contaminated the evidence. He feared he had gotten a false match because he was working on another case involving Bellamy at the same time. If Bellamy was Jane's killer, the prosecutor realized, they would have to find another way to prove it. Shaler was their best hope. For 6 months after Kay's press conference, Joan heard nothing from authorities. Then, just before Christmas 2004, Detective Seitz and Assistant Prosecutor Pete Warshaw appeared at her doorstep, asking for permission to exhume her sister's body to look for more evidence. New tests were needed, they said, and Jane's underwear is depleted of sufficient DNA. They hoped her remains would give them something. Joan needed time to think, she said. She couldn't imagine anything worse than disturbing the dead. If you want justice for Jane, the assistant prosecutor said, this is what you have to do. Jane's body was exhumed from Maple Grove Cemetery in the Kew Gardens section of Queens on February 1st, 2005. Her remains were delivered to the Monmouth County Medical Examiner's office, where, for the first time, it was determined the girl had been strangled as well as beaten. But her remains gave up little else, and nothing about the identity of her killer. The clothes she wore on the day of her death were delivered to Shaler at his lab in Bellevue Hospital in Manhattan. Markings on the white gossamer slip told Shaler it had been examined in the past, but probably long ago, when forensics was still a crude science. In the darkness of the lab, using a high-powered ultraviolet light, Shaler slid Jane's slip under a microscope and saw a blueprint of semen stains. He also discovered a bite mark on the shoulder of her pea coat. Shaler cut out the stains and had them tested for DNA. A week later, He had a DNA profile of the person whose semen was on Jane's slip. "I have good news and bad news," Shaler told investigators at the New Jersey State Police Crime Lab. "We have the DNA profile of Jane's killer, but it is not Jerry Bellamy." On February 7, 2006, Luis A. Valentin, who had succeeded Kay as prosecutor 6 months earlier, announced that the murder charges against Jerry Bellamy had been dismissed, and Bellamy would be set free. What Valentin didn't say was that after 38 years, the authorities were sure of who killed Jane. Not long afterward, Joan received a telephone call from Seitz, saying he and Warshaw wanted to come by to talk about Jane's case. Could she gather the rest of the family? As Joan Conway and her sisters had done before, they assembled around the island in the kitchen of Dolores Ramirez, the older sister with whom Jane had been living in East Keansburg, eager to hear what the men had to say. It was a Saturday evening, right before dinner time. Warshaw said they had good news. The mystery of who killed 13-year-old Jane had finally been solved. Jane's sisters looked at each other. Then Joan looked at Seitz. "It is who you thought it was all along," Seitz said. "Robert Zirinsky?" Joan asked. Seitz nodded. It took a moment for the news to sink in. The sisters had long suspected Zirinsky, but after the mix-up with Bellamy, they had given up on learning the truth. "When will he be charged?" Joan asked. The answer was not what she expected. Zirinsky would not be charged, at least not now, Warshaw said. "We hope you can have closure now, just knowing who killed Jane," Warshaw said, feeling terrible even as he spoke the words. Joan Conway looked at Detective Seitz, who sat at the counter with his head down. Jane's sisters had come to feel as if Seitz were family, and he was fond of them. He had worked 3 years trying to find out who murdered Jane. He had said it was personal, and that his whole office was invested in solving the case. Now it was solved, and they weren't doing anything? "I don't understand. DNA gets people out of prison. Why can't it put someone in?" Conway asked, echoing the words Prosecutor Kay had uttered months earlier. Seitz couldn't look at her. The men explained that a decision had been made. The case against Zirinsky was too risky because of the previous DNA mix-up under Kay. The mistake had been a colossal embarrassment for the prosecutor's office and fodder for any good defense attorney, and Valentin, the new prosecutor, wasn't willing to risk it. Unless Zirinsky confessed, or they came up with more evidence, the case wasn't going anywhere. "What do we do now?" Conway asked. "We have told you here today cannot leave this house," Warshaw said. "It could jeopardize any future case." Warshaw promised that his office would continue to work on Jane's case. "I'm sorry," Seitz said, looking defeated. After so many years of uncertainty, after years of hoping for justice for young Jane, Joan and her sisters finally knew what happened in the darkening hours of November 4th, 1968. They knew, but now they were being asked to do the unthinkable, to keep Robert Zirinsky's secret. Chapter 15. The Man Who Would Go Free. At 66, prisoner number 56449 is no longer the brawny weightlifter of his youth. Robert Zirinsky still walks with his chest puffed out, and he holds his head with the same arrogance he did at 34 when he was convicted of killing Rosemary Calandrello, a shy teenager from Atlantic Highlands. But after decades of sedentary prison lifestyle, in which he rarely joins the other inmates in the exercise yard outdoors at the New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, Zirinsky is doughy and sallow. The 16-inch biceps he once flaunted in shirt-sleeve muscle shirts are flabby now. He spends his days in a small cell, hunched over an old Smith Corona electric typewriter on a stainless steel table, next to a matching stainless steel urinal, tapping out letters and appeals with the single goal of getting out of prison. What he doesn't type, he writes out in a tiny, cramped cursive. "I have no girlfriend or female pen pals to write to," the convicted killer said in a recent letter. "However, it is important that I continue my legal work to achieve my freedom, so that I may be able to resume a normal life, hopefully in the near future." Zirinsky has never given an interview, except to former FBI profiler John Douglas, excerpts of which aired in 2000 as part of a television documentary, Faces of Evil. Zorinsky claims he agreed to that only because he was fooled into thinking it was a pre-parole psychological evaluation. But in correspondence over the past 4 months, Zorinsky has offered his thoughts and feelings on a wide range of topics, from his bizarre family dynamic to the accusations he is a serial killer. In his letters, Zorinsky is by turns cagey, plaintive, inquisitive, and matter-of-fact. Of his last visit to his dying mother, Zorinsky writes, "I was able to hold her hand, and I kissed the side of her face. I whispered in her ear that I was there for her, and that I loved her very much. It was terribly stressful for me to see my mother in that dying condition. However, it was the most important journey of my life to be able to visit my mother and comfort her before she passed away." Zorinsky insists he is a victim of a criminal justice system that wrongly convicted him of the 1969 murder of Rosemary Calandrello, then added insult to injury by suggesting he killed not once, but over and over again. Police officer Charles Bernowski in 1958, Jane Duryea in 1968, Linda Balbano in 1969, Joanne Delardo and Doreen Carlucci in 1974. Those are nothing more than, quote, false stories that have been made against me by disgruntled investigators who have been unable to surreptitiously trick me into waiving my constitutional rights to remain silent, he recently wrote. Public, Zorinsky says, has been irreparably poisoned by the news media with false stories made against me, unsupported by any evidence, with dramatic headlines in newspapers tantamount to lynch law. During his 32 years in prison for the Calandrello murder, Zorinsky has become something of a legal scholar, and he frequently mentions the latest appeal he has filed from prison. Attorneys he has hired over the years say he has a keen grasp of the law and a photographic memory that allows him to recall even the page numbers of statutes he has read. For the 90 minutes he is allowed out of his 8 by 10 foot cinder block cell every day, Zorinsky buries his head in books, studying case law under the library's bright fluorescent lights. While other inmates press for better food and more time in the exercise yard, he methodically, obsessively, hunts for loopholes in the law that could set him free. For years, Zorinsky denied he had anything to do with Rosemary Calandrello's disappearance. In 1988, he changed his story to say, yes, he did kill her, but not intentionally. Zorinsky told one investigator he buried Rosemary in a 3-foot-deep grave in a mountainous area in northwest New Jersey. He told Douglas, the criminal profiler, that he hauled the dead girl over his shoulder like, quote, 100-pound sack of potatoes, unquote, and threw her into the Atlantic Ocean. In numerous letters to authorities over the years, he has hinted that the location of Rosemary's body is just one of many secrets he holds, and he has offered to trade his secrets for his freedom. He even offered to barter with Sam Guzzi, the Atlantic Highlands cop who broke the Calandrello case, and continues in his retirement to try to pin Zorinsky with his second murder, to make sure Zorinsky never gets out of prison. Dear Sam, Zorinsky wrote in a 1994 letter to Guzzi, how are you doing? I hope things are going well for you. It has been 25 years since 1969, and I was hoping that the old adversarial roles that we had a quarter of a century ago might now be discarded and replaced by mutual friendship in the future. I would like to die at home rather than in prison. I am very sorry, and I deeply regret the past. I am writing to you with the hope that you might consider developing a friendship with me, and possibly helping me obtain some type of supervised release from prison. In return, I can be of immeasurable value to law enforcement in many areas, post-1963, heretofore unknown. 5 years later, in 1999, he was more specific, with Joseph Jakubik, the postal inspector who investigated the embezzlement of Zorinsky's trust fund by Zorinsky's sister Judith and her husband Peter Sapsa. Zorinsky told Jakubik he could solve between 5 and 10 homicides, all from the 1960s. He promised to give exact dates and information about how the crimes were committed. All he wanted in return was cab fare home to Linden. When that effort failed, Zorinsky sought a deal with Agent Dan Garabrandt of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. If he could live freely, he wrote to the agent in Newark on December 2, 1999, the FBI could study him at its headquarters in Quantico, Virginia. My cooperation can open analytical revelation into my past, which will be beneficial to society as a whole, Zorinsky wrote in the 2-page typed letter. When Zorinsky was convicted of the Calandrello murder on April 23, 1975, he was sentenced to serve at least 14 years, 9 months, and 11 days of the life term before becoming eligible for parole. His admission in 1988 to killing Calandrello came a year before his first parole board hearing in an interview with a prison psychiatrist. He hoped that if he finally took responsibility for the death, the board might consider releasing him. Zorinsky told the psychiatrist he first met Rosemary at a diner in Atlantic Highlands, where they enjoyed a casual conversation. 2 days later, he saw her again, this time walking in town, and offered her a ride. They stopped at a liquor store for 2 bottles of blackberry brandy and a beer. Then he drove towards Sandy Hook and pulled off the road into a wooded area. Rosemary did not want to drink, but with his encouragement, she took a few sips of the brandy and immediately fell sick. She got out of the car to throw up, Zorinsky said, and he accidentally ran over her. When he saw blood running from her ears, he told the psychiatrist, he panicked and put her in the trunk. He drove around for hours not knowing what to do, and finally disposed of her body by weighting it with a cinder block and throwing it off a ledge into a large body of water somewhere in northern New Jersey. Then he burned her clothes to get rid of the evidence. The story failed to sway the parole board. In August of 1989, it told Zorinsky his initial request for release was denied, quote, based on the nature of your ruthless crime, your prior criminal record, and poor professional reports, unquote. In April of 1996, after an emotional hearing in which Agnes Calandrello testified before the board, parole was denied again. Calandrello disputed Zorinsky's claim about accidentally killing her daughter. It was, quote, utterly implausible, unquote, that Rosemary, who was afraid of strangers and never drank, willingly got into the car with Zorinsky, she said. Calandrello told the members of the parole board that her sickly husband Daniel, quote, gave up, unquote, after Rosemary's disappearance. He died at age 66, 3 years after Zorinsky's 1975 conviction. Both she and her husband were overcome with, quote, extreme guilt, unquote, over what happened to their only daughter, Calandrello said. The panel was unanimous in its decision to deny parole. It is the belief of the board that Robert Zorinsky in 1996 is not a great deal different from the Robert Zorinsky of 1969, the board wrote in its report. In the 20 years since the murder, you have not told police exactly where Rosemary's body was taken, resulting in a recurring nightmare for Rosemary's family and friends. In an unsuccessful lawsuit against the parole board in 1997, Zorinsky attempted to explain why he couldn't locate Rosemary's body. He said he had been, quote, petrified by fear, unquote, after accidentally killing the girl, and drove aimlessly for hours with her body in his trunk. I first tried to dispose of the body by tying a cinder block to the body with a piece of cheesecloth taken from the trunk, he wrote, placing the body in a narrow stretch of water. I believe it was the Pequest River, near Route 46. The body would not sink. It was extremely dark. I probed the water with a stick and ascertained that it was very shallow water. I retrieved the body, discarded the cinder block, and placed the body back in the trunk. I decided to dispose of the body in the ocean. I drove on the road beside the ocean in Seabright, then turning left off the public street into an area that was dark and provided an access route to the ocean from the location where I parked. I wrapped the body in a blanket and placed it in the ocean from a rock formation. The body did not sink. I watched from the rocks as the body slowly floated away, drifting with each sea swell, until it disappeared from sight in the darkness. It is impossible to know where the ocean currents took the body. Parole was denied a third time in April 2003. We believe you have still not shown a great deal of insight into your crime, the board wrote. The board ruled Zorinsky could not formally apply for parole again until 2012, to give him more time to rehabilitate himself and to, quote, diminish the substantial likelihood that you would commit a crime if released, unquote. The board left open, however, the possibility of an earlier release. Quote, if the board determines at your annual review that you have made progress toward your rehabilitation, the board may reduce your future parole eligibility term. Unquote. The next annual review is scheduled for November 2007. In the meantime, Zorinsky continues to file appeals based on everything from the validity of various searches of his home and his car to the competency of a parade of attorneys who represented him. Malcolm Carton, who was the prosecutor responsible for getting the murder indictment in the Calandrello case, says he is convinced Zorinsky's persistence will pay off and that the prisoner eventually will find a more liberal panel of judges who will set him free based on a minor point of law or on the number of years he has served. I'm as certain of that as I am that he is a serial killer, Carton says. Only a second conviction will guarantee Zorinsky never becomes a free man, Carton says. But the chances of that seem remote, unless the current Monmouth County prosecutor, Luis Valentin, decides to take advantage of the DNA evidence linking Zorinsky to the 1968 killing of 13-year-old Jane Duryea. Zorinsky denies any involvement in the slaying. I most certainly was not involved in it, as I was not involved in the numerous other allegations made against me over the years, he wrote in May. Attorneys from Valentin's office have told the Duryea family they do not plan to charge Zorinsky based on the DNA evidence. Asked about the status of the case, Valentin would say only that his office does not comment on open investigations. In his letters, Zorinsky says he wonders where he will go and what he will do when he is finally free. He writes that he survives in prison by thinking about going home, although home is no longer his family's place at 402 Bower Street in Linden. He sold the house in 2000 to pay off legal fees. His inheritance was drained away by his sister, Judith, who also sold his furniture and his car. He expects to recoup money from an appellate court decision in July 2007 that reversed a civil judgment against him. The judgment had been won by Betty Bernowski, who had convinced the civil court jury in 2003 that Zorinsky was responsible for the death of her husband, Charles. Agreeing with Zorinsky that he should not have been sued after being acquitted in a criminal trial, the appellate court ordered the 76-year-old widow to return $154,000 to him. Even if he receives the money, Zorinsky says, he has no one waiting for him outside prison. His family is gone. His beloved mother, Veronica, died in 1995, and his sister Judith died in 2004. His ex-wife, Lynn, remarried and started a new life long ago. I do feel very lonely without having anyone in my life, Zorinsky says. I do miss my family very much, especially my mother and Lynn. I have nothing left. Nothing except his secrets. I know you would like to interview me, Zorinsky wrote. I would also like to meet you in person, however, not in prison. If I am successful in overturning the Calandrello conviction and obtaining my freedom, I will gladly afford you all the interviews you desire. There is so much that I could tell you about, going back to the year 1956. Epilogue. The Jane Duryea murder case remains officially unsolved after 39 years. Luis Valentin, the Monmouth County prosecutor, said his office, quote, is focused on a specific suspect, unquote, but he declined to give the name, citing his ethical duty to protect the investigation. The prosecutor's office asks anyone with information about the Duryea case to call Detective Ryan Muller at 800-533-7443. Jane's family has heard nothing from authorities since last summer, when they were told Robert Zorinsky was her killer. Earlier this month, Jane's sister Joan Conway called the prosecutor's office to ask that a collection of family photographs be returned if Valentin was not planning to pursue charges against Zorinsky. Several days later, she received a call from the prosecutor's staff, saying the photographs had been lost. Detective Paul Seitz told the Duryea family he would not retire from the Monmouth County prosecutor's office until their case was solved. He retired last December. Robert Shaler, the medical examiner, says there is no doubt the semen on Jane's slip is Robert Zorinsky's. Like Duryea's sisters, Shaler cannot understand why the Monmouth County prosecutor's office has not charged Zorinsky with Jane's murder. Such strong evidence is hard to come by, he said. Quote, "It is his DNA, and it is on her slip," unquote. Jerry Bellamy is suing the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office over the 2004 murder charge leveled against him in the Jane Duryea case and his subsequent 21-month incarceration. In his lawsuit, filed earlier this year, Bellamy claims the state police and the prosecutor, even after being told that the DNA evidence was contaminated, allowed him to remain in prison. The Linda Balabano case collects dust in the cold case files of the Middlesex County Prosecutor's Office in New Brunswick. Before his retirement earlier this year, Assistant Prosecutor William Lamb said the hair found on a ball-peen hammer in Zerinski's car trunk in 1969, which had a high degree of similarity to Balabano's hair, was alone not sufficient evidence to charge Zerinski with her murder. The hair is now depleted of DNA because of previous tests, Lamb said. The only other physical evidence linking Zerinski to Balabano's killing is a Philco radio found in the Zerinski home in Linden during a police search in 1975. Shortly before Balabano's death in March 1969, she had purchased such a radio, and her mother, Peggy, told police she would have had it with her when she disappeared. When Peggy Balabano was asked by investigators to identify the radio found in Zerinski's home, she said she was sure it was the one that belonged to her daughter. According to an April 25, 1975 story in the New York Daily News, Peggy Balabano recognized a burn mark on the radio's exterior. Although 6 years had passed since her daughter's death, she still had the cardboard box that the radio came in. When police attempted to check the serial number on the radio found in the Zerinski home, they discovered the number had been scratched off. According to Zerinski's ex-wife, Lynn McDermott, Zerinski's mother, Veronica, kept it in the kitchen to listen to music as she cooked. Prosecutors in Middlesex County have long said that, barring a confession from Zerinski or some other compelling evidence, he would not be charged with Balabano's murder. Zerinski is the only suspect, and the case has not been reviewed since 1999, according to former First Assistant Prosecutor Tom Kapsick, who recently retired from the office. "I don't think there was ever a better suspect than Zerinski," Kapsick said. However, he said, the hair evidence was not enough. If we had a positive match, like with DNA, that would be significant. Jeanette Dallardo says it has been several years since she has heard from investigators about the unsolved 1974 killing of her daughter Joanne and Doreen Carlucci, the teenagers who vanished after stopping for ice cream at a sweet shop following a dance at a Catholic youth center in Woodbridge. The Dallardo and Carlucci families lived in the Colonia section of Woodbridge, near a Zerinski relative whose home Robert regularly visited. But because the girls' bodies were found in Manalapan, the case comes under the jurisdiction of the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office. Investigators have recently begun taking a closer look at the case and ordered new DNA testing, according to an official from the prosecutor's office. Ann Logan, a 19-year-old Seton Hall student whose battered body was discovered in a vacant lot in Roselle in September 1973, has long been included in the list of victims authorities suspect Zerinski of killing. But a report on DNA test results dated December 27, 1999, from Cellmark Diagnostics in Germantown, Maryland, sent to Union County Assistant Prosecutor William Colano, states Robert Zerinski, quote, is excluded as a source of the DNA obtained from a sperm sample, unquote, taken from the crime scene. Colano told the Star-Ledger on August 23, 2007, that Zerinski is no longer considered a suspect in the case. This opens up the probability that it was someone other than Robert Zerinski who committed this heinous act, Colano said. Logan's family says no one ever told them that. Not until last week. On August 22, 2007, a day after the Star-Ledger inquired about the case, Detective Captain Gary Riccardelli of the Roselle Police Department drove to the freehold home of Ann's sister, Mary Logan, a former missionary who teaches theology at Red Bank Catholic High School, to tell her about the 8-year-old test results. The last time the Logans were contacted by police was in 1999, after Judith Zerinski Sapsa implicated her brother in the murder of Rahway police officer Charles Bernosky and told authorities she believed he was responsible for killing young girls. The circumstantial evidence suggesting a connection between Zerinski and Ann's murder was significant. Zerinski lived a mile from the supermarket in Roselle where Ann was last seen, and her family identified an earring found in Zerinski's home as belonging to the slain girl. The manner in which Anne was murdered matched other cases linked to Zorinsky. The girl was brutally beaten. She was found naked from the waist down, and she had been strangled and raped. After the statements from Zorinsky's sister, the police decided to send DNA samples from sperm taken from the Logan crime scene for testing by the FBI. According to notes kept by Mary Logan, dated October 5, 1999, a Roselle detective told her that, quote, "The FBI is excited by the sample." When Logan called Roselle police on October 8, 1999, to ask about the results of the test, she was told, quote, "The FBI results have been delayed." When she heard nothing by November 17, 1999, she called the detective again and was told he was no longer a detective. The family heard nothing more until August 22, 2007. Despite the DNA results, Mary Logan says she is convinced Zorinsky killed her sister. "I understand this is not Robert Zorinsky's DNA," she said. "I don't understand why, based on one slide handled by who knows how many people over the years, you can state that he is no longer a suspect. DNA tests are only as good as the people who perform them." Said Riccardelli, "A reasonable person would say Robert Zorinsky is involved, but the DNA says he is not. I can't explain it." Agnes Calandrello died in June 2006 at the age of 89. She never gave up trying to find out what happened to her daughter. She had a headstone erected at a local cemetery with Rosemary's name and date of birth etched in the granite, but with no date of death. Sam Guzzi turned 80 in April. He lives in Atlantic Highlands with his wife Barbara, whom he met during the Calandrello investigation. She was then Barbara Hardy, the mother of a 12-year-old girl Zorinsky tried to lure into his car 2 days before he abducted and killed Rosemary Calandrello in August 1969. Hardy provided Guzzi with a license plate number that led to Zorinsky. Last summer, Guzzi was asked by the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office to share his files with investigators in the Jane Duryea case. He has heard nothing since. Lynn McDermott, Zorinsky's ex-wife, lives with a new husband in a motorhome they drive between 2 states and parks only in gated communities with round-the-clock security. Zorinsky's sister, Judith Sapsa, died in September 2004, but her husband lives with their daughter's family in southern New Jersey. Of Zorinsky, the daughter says, "If he gets out, he'll kill us all." Theodore Schiffer, the cousin who testified in court that Zorinsky killed Rahway police officer Charles Bernowski in 1958, served 3 years in prison and now moves from place to place, never registering a telephone number or address for fear Zorinsky will find him, according to his brother, Robert Schiffer. In 2001, shortly after Robert Zorinsky was found not guilty of killing Rahway police officer Charles Bernowski in 1958, Bernowski's widow Betty filed a wrongful death suit against Zorinsky in civil court. In August 2003, a civil jury found Zorinsky responsible for Bernowski's death and awarded his widow $9.5 million plus interest. In February 2004, $154,143 was seized from Zorinsky as partial payment. Betty Bernowski received about $97,000 after legal costs, and she divided the money among her 6 children. Last month, a state appellate court ordered Bernowski to give the money back to Zorinsky, finding the passage of time since the officer's death had impaired Zorinsky's ability to present a defense. In the wake of that decision, Assemblyman Patrick Degnan has drafted a bill that would eliminate New Jersey's 2-year statute of limitations on wrongful death suits. Bernowski says the money she collected from Zorinsky is gone, and she has no way to repay it. That paves the way for Zorinsky to seize her assets, including the modest home in Rahway where she lived with her husband and raised their children. A fund has been set up to help Bernowski repay Zorinsky, and around $30,000 has been collected, most of it from strangers. Donations may be sent to the Bernowski Justice Fund, care of Kenneth S. Javerbond, Park Place Legal Center, 959 South Springfield Avenue, Springfield, New Jersey, 07081 3555. People walk up to me and say, "We are with you," Bernowski said. "It makes me feel like the load is a little bit lighter." Robert Zorinsky continues to spend his time in prison, writing letters and filing appeals. His latest appeal in the Calandrello case, based on his contention that Rosemary Calandrello's death was caused by accident, not murder, is pending. Zirinsky stays positive about his future. In a 1999 interview with former FBI profiler John Douglas, Zirinsky said, "I always figure this way. Where there's light, there's hope."